Turkey just delivered a crippling blow to Russia. By leveraging its control over the Black Sea and making a bold statement regarding Crimea, Turkey is forcing Putin into a corner. The man who thought invading Ukraine would divide the world and prove his military genius now finds himself outplayed by Erdogan. So what's pushing Erdogan to take such bold steps? And how might this shake up the regional power game? Turkey's moves are turning the tables on Putin faster than he could have predicted, and he's not exactly known for his foresight these days. But Erdogan's boldness didn't come out of nowhere. It's part of a carefully crafted strategy Putin clearly underestimated. For 2 decades, Erdogan has been steadily tightening his grip on Turkey, embracing a militarized, neo-Ottoman vision for the country. Meanwhile, Putin likely thought he'd found a reliable ally, someone who'd happily buy his discounted oil and gas while the rest of the world shut Russia out. Turkish purchases of Russian energy doubled between 2021 and 22, and Putin probably assumed Erdogan was in his pocket. Big mistake. If Putin really believed he had Erdogan under control, he's missed the plot entirely. Turkey and Russia have clashed for centuries. Erdogan has been playing both sides in the Ukrainian conflict, but on September 11th, he made his move, declaring Crimea must be returned to Ukraine. Why would Erdogan pull the rug out from under Putin now? Simple, Putin isn't nearly as clever as he thinks. The wannabe czar is discovering the hard way that Erdogan's strategy is way more ruthless than he ever anticipated. And what better place to hit Putin where it hurts than Crimea? This isn't just a random patch of land, it's one of the most important pieces of real estate in Eurasia. Any power that controls Crimea controls the Black Sea. Historically, Crimea was ruled by various Turkish polities before the Ottoman Empire took it over from the Crimean Khanate in the mid-15th century. Of course, Peter the Great eventually realized the strategic value of this peninsula 250 years later, recognizing it as Russia's key gateway to a warm water port. For Russia, Crimea wasn't just about trade, it was a matter of security, a staging point that once enabled centuries of brutal slave raids across Eastern Europe. A long series of wars followed Peter the Great's initial attack on the Turks in 1686, ending with Russia's takeover of Crimea in 1783. Still, Russia and Turkey continued to fight one another until World War I. The Ottoman Turks might have lost Crimea, but they still had an interest in preventing Russia from getting too strong in the Black Sea. This interest continued even into the 20th century. Turkey joined NATO in 1952 for this purpose, and to this day, it hosts American nuclear weapons on its soil as a way to check Russia. Turkey's membership and basing arrangements with the US military was the only card NATO had to play in the Cold War, as the Black Sea was otherwise a Soviet lake. Crimea was like a dagger pointed at Turkey from the moment that Russia acquired it. In this regard, the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine in 1954 and its retention as Ukrainian territory following the end of the Soviet Union was an excellent development for Ankara. After 1991, Turkey's historical rival had been left with little influence in the Black Sea, a complete reversal of the situation that prevailed in the Cold War. The Turks also maintained an ethnic interest in Crimea. Russia took the place over, but the majority of its population remained comprised of Crimean Tatars, a Turkish ethnic group, until the mid-19th century. Russia recognized the importance of keeping stable control of Crimea, though, and took coercive measures to ethnically cleanse it of its Tatar population and replace them with Russians. The Crimean Tatars were subject to forced assimilation and deportation. Russia's oppression of this population peaked in 1944, when Joseph Stalin deported all the remaining Tatars to Central Asia. Between 150,000 and 200,000 Crimean Tatars were sent on this journey. Upon arriving at their destinations, they were confined to within a 5-kilometer limit of their imposed places of residence and had to sign a monthly attendance register with the NKVD. In these open-air prisons, they were consigned to work on state-owned farms or factories in return for menial wages. The Tatars were not allowed to return to Crimea until 1988, amidst Gorbachev's perestroika reforms. By 2002, 260,000 had returned out of an estimated 500,000 in ex-Soviet territory. Naturally, the Tatars, which today make up around 12% of Crimea's population, were not happy when Russia unilaterally annexed the peninsula in 2014. Since then, Russia has gone back to some of its old tricks. In March, a United Nations human rights team traveled to Ukraine and sought urgent access to Crimea over alleged mistreatment of the Tatars there, including the death of a well-known activist. Tatar language education has also languished under Russian rule. Pressures have mounted for them to speak Russian instead. With this history, it should not be surprising that Turkey opposed Putin's moves in Crimea from the beginning, although not always as strongly as the West would have liked. In 2015, it condemned Russia's persecution of the Crimean Tatars, but did not go so far as to become part of the sanctions regime imposed in response to Moscow's actions, there or in Ukraine as a whole. Turkey's lack of zeal was a preview of things to come, and it might have been a reason why Putin thought he had a card to play with Erdogan. Meanwhile, Turkey's NATO allies became increasingly frustrated about Ankara's cozy relationship with Moscow. Though the two countries found themselves on opposite sides of the Syrian civil war, they mostly gave each other a wide berth, with the exception of one notorious incident in 2015 when a Turkish F-16 shot down one of Russia's Su-24 fighter jets. According to the Turks, this was because the Russian plane had violated Turkish airspace despite warnings. Putin disputed this claim and insisted the plane was flying over Syria's internationally recognized territory. Another close call came in the Idlib offensive in northern Syria between late 2019 and early 2020, when Syrian government forces surrounded several Turkish observation bases. Turkey launched a counter-offensive, but a meeting between Putin and Erdogan in March resulted in an acceptable ceasefire between them. Despite these rows, Turkey and Russia maintained amicable relations. Turkey has even been a buyer of Russia's S-400 air defense system. The decision resulted in American sanctions and Turkey's exclusion from the F-35 program for fear that the Russians would get important data on the aircraft. Turkey also held up Finland from joining NATO for a year and Sweden from joining for 2 years, amidst its objections regarding those two countries being allegedly friendly to Kurdish factions that the Turks consider to be terrorist groups. This diplomatic impasse was not done in league with Russia, but Putin certainly welcomed it. Again, Turkey was displaying its reputation as increasingly the odd man out of NATO, one that no longer shared the transatlantic alliance's commitment to a liberal world order. Putin and Erdogan share important similarities. Like Putin, Turkey's increasingly authoritarian leader is reportedly a proponent of the civilization state model of the world. This worldview is a rebuttal to the foundation of modern international relations, which regards each state as being entitled to absolute sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Instead, the most important components of the civilization state model are ties of culture, religion, ethnicity, and language that can transcend those borders. The state is tasked with defending and preserving those things. Putin invaded Ukraine on these pretexts, as he regards the modern norm of international relations as being a Western imposition coming out of the treaties of Westphalia and Versailles. Putin repeatedly stressed these ideas in the build-up to his invasion of Ukraine, when he called the end of the Soviet Union the end of historical Russia, an outcome which separated millions of ethnic Russians from the motherland. He also repeated his accusations that began in 2014, claiming that neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine had taken over the government and were oppressing ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people with the West's backing. In his 2021 essay entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, Putin further elaborated about his civilization-centered worldview when he claimed that Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus had historically been one nation and one people, united under the Russian Empire and Soviet Union and then torn apart, now separated by these Western impositions of international relations. Toward the end of the essay, Putin was more transparent with his ideas about what world order should look like. He mentioned that though Western countries had demarcated borders, they were close to one another and shared ties of culture and language, with people frequently crossing between their territories and feeling at home because of those similarities. He gave the examples of the United States and Canada, as well as Germany and Austria. He said the same was true for Ukrainians who now live in Russia. Rather than being separate, he said, we see them as our own close people. Putin also said that the entire concept of Ukrainian statehood, should it follow the West's model, is based on the idea of being anti-Russian. He vowed that he would never allow Russia's historical territories and people to be used against Russia. He concluded, I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. Our spiritual, human, and civilizational ties, formed for centuries and have their origins in the same sources. They have been hardened by common trials, achievements, and victories. Our kinship has been transmitted from generation to generation. It is in the hearts and memories of people living in modern Russia and Ukraine, in the blood ties that unite millions of our families. Together we have always been and will be many times stronger and more successful, for we are one people. Both Eastern and Western historians criticized Putin's essay as an ahistorical piece of propaganda, but it reveals a lot about his notions of international relations. His essay is therefore important not only with regards to the invasion of Ukraine, but his relations with foreign leaders. This supposed civilization view of the world is one of the reasons why Putin's relationship with China's Xi Jinping is reportedly close. Xi also views the world through these ideas, which is part of why he has been so militarily active around Taiwan and even expanded into the South China Sea. One of the justifications his government gives for the fortification of islands in the area is that these waters have been historically Chinese. In 2015, Xi himself claimed that the islands had been Chinese territory since ancient times. The following year, an international court ruled against China's territorial claims and its 9-dashed line map, but Beijing ignored the ruling. It simply did not view the world in the same way. The idea that an international court in The Hague could tell China what to do in its own supposed historical territory was, to Xi and his subordinates, yet another Western imposition on questions that are Chinese in character. These notions of international law are important with regards to contemporary relations between Russia and Turkey. The post-Ottoman Republic of Turkey was founded on the model of being a modern, Western-style nation-state. Westernization was one of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's highest priorities. However, Turkey has gradually gone on a different course under Erdogan. The most symbolic change arguably came in 2020, when he converted Hagia Sophia into a mosque. Atatürk had transformed the building from a mosque into a non-religious museum in 1935 as a marker of his efforts to modernize the country through secular reforms. Erdogan decided to take the opposite course, despite international objections. The decision was meant to appeal to Erdogan's base of conservative Muslim supporters in Turkey. Crucially, it was also designed to appeal to devout Muslims beyond Turkey's borders who had long called for Hagia Sophia to be made into a mosque again. Western leaders objected to the conversion, but the Turks considered this an imposition. During the past decade, as Erdogan continues to entrench himself in power, Turkey has become much more militarily active. Once a great power with a far-flung military reach, Atatürk presided over a Turkish strategic retreat under his peace at home, peace in the world foreign policy. To this day, the Turkish government claims that it seeks to maintain this policy. Even during World War II, Turkey remained neutral until the closing months. Turkey's entrance into NATO slightly shifted this foreign policy, but since Soviet Russia now had near hegemonic power in the Black Sea, Ankara was left with little choice. Intervention in the Cyprus dispute in 1974 marked the beginning of a more active Turkish foreign policy. Turkey's long war with the Kurdistan Workers' Party also helped to gradually bring it out of strategic retreat, but Erdogan accelerated it. Turkey is no longer a passive player. It's conducted major combat operations in Iraq and Syria and has built military relationships with countries as far afield as Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, and as we will soon see, Eastern Europe. Its military footprint includes most of the lands formerly within the Ottoman Empire. Erdogan has also repeatedly questioned the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, which sets Turkey's internationally recognized borders. He claims that Atatürk was forced to make these concessions under unequal terms and that Turkey has the right to demand a return to an earlier territorial plan set out by the Ottoman legislature in 1920. These territories included Cyprus, parts of northern Syria and Iraq, all of Armenia, parts of Georgia and Iran, and the Aegean Islands, stretching west to parts of mainland Greece. Mapmakers in Turkey have begun to be more aggressive with their territorial claims, including parts of Armenia and Syria within Turkish borders. It's a tactic they might have learned from their Chinese counterparts, who are conducting similar salami-slicing operations to assert claims to territory beyond their internationally recognized borders using these maps as part of their information warfare efforts. Turkey's increasingly active foreign policy under Erdogan has lent to accusations that it now has neo-Ottoman ambitions. While some Western experts have focused on growing authoritarianism within Turkey's borders, others, such as those at the Middle East Institute, warn that this is too narrow a viewpoint to understand its true objectives. One of them is in the promotion of a pan-Islamist political movement. There is a historical bias for this policy. The Ottoman sultans claimed that they were the legitimate caliphs, the successors of the Prophet Muhammad, and rulers of all members of the Muslim community. The title combined secular and religious functions. Erdogan has not gone that far, but his government has positioned itself as the defender and promoter of Islam. The return of Hagia Sophia to mosque status was designed with this in mind. Turkey has financed the construction of mosques all over the world, with Erdogan himself participating in many of the opening ceremonies. Putin has been watching Erdogan's moves and might have seen something of a kindred spirit. Someone who rejects Western standards of international norms and seeks to remake the world's order on ideological lines suitable for him. However, he should have done a little more of his history homework. Erdogan might be tilting away from the West, but that does not mean he's a reliable partner for Russia to work with. Crimea had been Ottoman territory until 1783, after all. Along with demanding the rights of Crimean Tatars be protected, Turkey did not recognize any Russian right to Crimea. In 2016, Erdogan told his then Ukrainian counterpart, Petro Poroshenko, that Russia was illegally occupying the peninsula. He reiterated this stance following the invasion, when he said that international law demanded that Russia return Crimea to Ukraine. Turkey also forged a strong military partnership with Ukraine in the years before the war. Turkey has been a provider of large amounts of military equipment to Ukraine, most notably its Bayraktar TB2 drone, which is only the most famous example. In 2021, a classified memo was leaked. Its content detailed the long-running relationship between the Turkish and Ukrainian militaries. Part of this relationship included secret cross-training between the Ukrainians and Turkey's Elite Special Forces Command. The relationship dated to at least April 2016. From that time, Turkey's special operations advisors trained Ukrainian troops in missions ranging from counter-terrorism, surveillance, cross-border incursions, and sabotage. This training has come in handy as Ukrainian special operations teams have conducted or assisted in such missions behind the lines and into Russian territory. Crimea has been a particular target of these operations. When the war started, Turkey lent important diplomatic aid to Ukraine. It condemned the invasion in Resolution ES 11-1 of the United Nations General Assembly. More importantly, it invoked the wartime provisions in the 1936 Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits. By officially recognizing Putin's so-called special military operation as a war, the Turks closed off the Dardanelles and Bosporus to ships from the Russian Navy, permitting only certain recognized ships in the Black Sea Fleet to return to their base, as specified in Article 19. Russia had hoped to use its closer relationship with Turkey to avoid this. 3 days after the invasion began, Turkey exercised these powers. As a result, the Russian Black Sea Fleet cannot be reinforced. Russia was therefore obligated to be cautious about how it used the vessels it had available in the theater and limited its offensive potential. Ukraine subsequently destroyed or heavily damaged many of these vessels, forcing them to retreat. In September 2024, Erdogan reiterated its intention to see Crimea returned to Ukraine. Our support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence is unwavering. The return of Crimea to Ukraine is a requirement of international law. He also reiterated his support for the Crimean Tatar community, insisting it was a top foreign policy priority for Turkey. His conditions for the end of the war were a peace based on the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Erdogan might not be as respectful of those notions elsewhere, but when it comes to the Black Sea, his country's interests remain keeping Russia from becoming too powerful. Supporting Ukraine is the best way for him to do that. Turkey has cleverly played both sides of the conflict. It's bought Russian energy for bargain prices while continuing its traditional foreign policy of counteracting Russia in the Black Sea. Turkey must also champion the Crimean Tatars if it wants to be taken seriously as the leading power for the Muslim faith. Putin might have seen a fellow autocrat in Erdogan, but autocrats typically aren't bound by deep friendship or ideological ties. They will tend to do what's best for them. Having Crimea remain a Russian outpost in the Black Sea is not best for Turkey. If anything, Erdogan might secretly want it back for himself. What do you think will happen next in the dance between Turkey and Russia? Is Erdogan's recent insistence that Crimea be returned to Ukraine part of his strategy to drive a harder bargain and get Russian energy for even cheaper prices? Or is he saying this out of a true commitment to Ukraine's sovereign rights under the status quo approach to international relations? In the last 10 years, a surprising military powerhouse has emerged, not in the often-watched waters of the Indo-Pacific, but in the strategic crossroads of the Middle East and Africa. This nation has pivoted from a defensive stance to ambitious offensive capabilities, growing increasingly authoritarian domestically while shaking up regional politics. Nope, we're not talking about China. This is Turkey, a long-standing ally of the US through NATO. Yet, Ankara's bold military maneuvers have occasionally clashed with the West's vision of a stable, rule-based international order. In this video, we dive into Turkey's journey from the post-Ottoman shadows into a controversial player on today's geopolitical stage, exploring its neo-Ottoman ambitions and the frictions these create within NATO. Can Turkey carve out a new sphere of influence under the watchful eyes of its historical allies? Let's unpack the story. Turkey has long been a large military spender. Even with the end of the Cold War, Turkey continued to spend well over 2% of its GDP on its armed forces, one of the few NATO countries to do so. Defense spending reached a new low of about 1.8% in 2015, although there was also an outlier of 1.2% in 2022. In 2023, Turkey announced it would increase its military spending by 150% in 2024. After the United States, it has NATO's largest military force, with over 1 million personnel between its active duty, reserve, and paramilitary units. Turkey's military is ranked 8th in the 2024 Global Firepower Index, the third highest in NATO after the United States and United Kingdom. Turkey's geopolitical location has necessitated that it maintain a stronger defense than many other of its NATO allies. To the south lies the conflict-prone Middle Eastern region. To the north lies Russia, a country Turkey has had battles with for centuries. More recently, Armenia and Azerbaijan have erupted into conflict too. Turkey does not have the benefit of being buffered like many NATO countries do in Europe. However, in recent years, the reach of the Turkish military has expanded, and it's created a domestic defense industry whose exports are expanding far further. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the chaotic aftermath of World War I, the new Republic of Turkey began a period of strategic retreat. Under its first president, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, Turkey attempted to discard its Muslim imperial past and become a secular, industrial, and homogeneous Turkish nation-state based on the Western model of civilization. In a sign of its inward-looking policy during this time, Turkey stayed neutral in World War II until early 1945, although it was a founding member of the United Nations and participated in the Korean War under the UN's banner. Its soldiers performed there with great distinction. It was one of the early members of NATO, joining the alliance in 1952. All of these moves suggested Turkey's continued policy of acting in alignment with the West, and its commitment to the post-World War II international order, constructed largely by the West. In the late 20th century, though, Turkey began to display signs that it was slowly shaking off its strategic retreat and would act more unilaterally. In July 1974, Turkey intervened on Cyprus following a coup by Greek nationalists, who wanted to unify the island with Greece itself, since Cypriot Greeks constitute the majority of the island's inhabitants. On the pretext of protecting the ethnic minority Turkish population, the Turkish military occupied the island and still does, with a force of about 40,000 troops. It has since recognized Northern Cyprus as its own independent nation, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. No other country recognizes it, but military reality has defeated recognized international law. The standoff continues to this day, and experts tend to acknowledge that a two-state model is the only reasonably realistic way of ending the dispute peacefully. Also important to Turkey's change in strategic posture was the rise of Recep Tayyip Erdogan to power and what he has meant for the country's military. Erdogan has dominated the country's politics for the past 2 decades, first serving as prime minister between 2003 and 2014, and then as the country's first directly elected president. Erdogan has made the professionalization of Turkey's military a priority of his. Under him, the Turkish armed forces have moved away from the old system of one which required men between the ages of 21 to 41 who have not graduated from a university to serve in uniform for at least a year. Instead, Turkey has increasingly modeled itself on a contract-based system in a bid to professionalize the armed forces. This system struggled to get off the ground at first. By 2016, Turkey had difficulties finding recruits for the 80,000 contract positions available for professional soldiers at the time. However, the situation has gotten much better since then. Just 6 years later, more than half of the personnel in the Turkish armed forces were professional troops, exceeding the number of conscripts in Ankara's military for the first time. The professionalization of the Turkish military is an important component of its expanding reach. Conscripted soldiers on short-term stints of service cannot be expected to be deployed far from home, especially for lengthy periods. However, thanks to the increasing ratio of professional troops in the Turkish armed forces, this problem is abating, and Turkey is building up its presence in sending troops on deployments outside of its internationally recognized borders. Erdogan's control over his increasingly professional military was strengthened following a failed coup in the summer of 2016. The more immediate impetus for the expansion in Turkish military power in the region was the Arab Spring in 2011. This wave of unrest and revolution quickly spread from Tunisia to the Turkish border, destabilizing Syria and plunging it into civil war. The war in Syria caused great alarm in Turkey, not only because of its shared border and the flood of refugees that arrived there, but because of perennial fears of Kurdish separatism within its own territory. 15 million Kurds are concentrated in southwestern Turkey. In 1978, the Kurdistan Workers' Party (PKK) was formed, originally with the goal of spreading communism, but later evolving into a Kurdish nationalist organization with armed and political wings. Since 1984, Turkey has fought a conflict with the PKK, which it and the United States considers to be a terrorist organization. Between then and 1999, this conflict was serious, with 30,000 deaths. Low-level operations have continued. Attempts to end the conflict have been made, but none have succeeded, and the PKK remains popular in southeastern Turkey. When the war in Syria began in 2011, Turkey called for the removal of Bashar al-Assad from power. It backed the non-Kurdish Syrian opposition forces, but above all, it wanted to ensure that there would be no autonomous Kurdish area established in Syrian territory, or at least to limit the influence of whatever Kurdish zone did come out of the conflict. Ankara feared that if a strong autonomous zone for the Kurds appeared, it would fuel Kurdish separatism within Turkey's borders. To ensure this would not happen, Turkey has had to walk a tightrope of competing interests. In 2016, it began to intervene militarily in Syria as part of the anti-ISIS coalition, but it also hit Kurdish forces with unilateral airstrikes. This worsened its relations with the United States, which strongly backs Kurdish forces in northern Syria. Despite ordinarily being on opposing sides of the conflict, Turkey and Russia came to an understanding that it could attack the Kurds with Russian support. Turkey also received support for the creation of a safe zone in the Idlib Governorate, which borders Turkey. Turkish troops unilaterally deployed to several observation posts there in 2017. Some of these observation posts were encircled in several offensives by the Syrian government with the support of Russia, Iran, and its proxies. Turkey abandoned some of the posts, but its military remains present in northern Syria. Meanwhile, in October 2019, Turkey launched a controversial offensive into northeastern Syria following American withdrawal from the area. Under a deal negotiated between Russia and Turkey, Kurdish fighters were eventually forced to withdraw 18 miles back from the border. The new buffer would be partially controlled by Russian and Syrian government forces, but Turkey would retain the territory it took in the offensive from October. This area and part of western Syria on the border remains under Turkish control. Human rights abuses in the Turkish-controlled zones have reportedly been common, with accusations of ethnic cleansing among the Kurdish people there. Turkey has also intervened in northern Iraq, where about 8.4 million Kurdish people reside. As early as the 1990s, Turkey pursued PKK militants across the border, but its strategy changed in the mid-2010s. The rise of ISIS gave Turkey a convenient opportunity to expand its military presence in Iraq. This expansion gave rise to the Zilkan military base near the town of Bashika, on the high ground near Mosul in the Nineveh Governorate in 2014. This base has come under attack by rockets several times in recent years. Turkey has expanded its presence in Iraq with more outposts in much the same way it's done in Syria. Over 100 Turkish outposts are spread throughout northern Iraq, and indeed, Turkey now controls most of the Iraqi northern border. Turkey uses these bases to monitor Kurdish activities and launch longer-range special missions and aircraft and drone strikes. Iraq objected strongly to this military presence, but recently the two countries announced a wide-ranging agreement. Under its terms, Iraq would help clear the area of PKK militants and cooperate on the Iraq Development Road, which would connect Turkey to the Persian Gulf via road and rail, creating a crossroads of trade between the region, India, and Europe. In turn, this area would sideline the traditional longer route through Saudi Arabia and the Gulf of Aden. Perhaps to buttress this agreement, Turkey has announced plans to launch a greater offensive into Iraq this summer. To further protect its burgeoning influence in the Persian Gulf, Turkey has the Tariq bin Ziyad military base in Qatar, which it established in 2015. In 2019, the base was expanded to include naval and air components. Today, 5,000 people are stationed there. The base is obviously a threat to Saudi Arabia and makes Turkey less reliant on Saudi energy, since it can source some of it from the now well-protected route from Qatar. If the Iraqi Development Road comes to fruition, Turkey will be even less reliant and will be able to better support the base through a direct land connection with its homeland. Qatar in turn signed a security agreement with Turkey in 2022 to permit its troops to train with Turkish personnel on Turkish territory. Since Qatar was blockaded by Saudi Arabia and several other Arab League states between 2017 and 21, the cooperation with Turkey is a critical item of leverage for the Qataris and increases Ankara's influence there even more. While Turkey has immediate security concerns in Iraq, the Persian Gulf, and Syria, it's used its new military muscle to expand its presence far further afield. In 2017, Turkey established its largest foreign military base near Mogadishu in Somalia. The base followed on the heels of humanitarian intervention that began in 2011, which saw the recreation of services that have been devastated by Somalia's long civil war, such as educational and healthcare institutions. Turkey has trained thousands of Somali soldiers at the base, and in return for its humanitarian and security efforts, Ankara has been granted development rights, such as to the offshore and onshore oil resources in Somalia. These resources must be secured, however, and Turkey has taken up anti-piracy operations in the piracy-plagued region accordingly. Conveniently, this gives Turkey leverage over the busy shipping lanes that go through the Gulf of Aden, either coming toward or moving away from the Suez Canal. In February 2024, Turkey and Somalia expanded their ties even further, including an agreement for the former to help develop a navy for the latter. Turkey will receive 30% of the revenue generated from Somalia's exclusive economic zone in exchange. In January 2020, the Turkish parliament approved a military intervention in Libya, another country torn by civil war originating with the Arab Spring. This intervention followed on the heels of a November agreement with the Government of National Accord in Tripoli, which the United Nations recognized as the official government of the post-Gaddafi Libya. In a convenient innovation, Ankara and Tripoli agreed to create an exclusive economic zone about 18 miles wide, stretching the entire Mediterranean between northeast Libya and southwestern Turkey. These waters have valuable oil and natural gas reserves. The rights of Greece, whose waters this area would at the very least skirt, were ignored. However, Libya's civil war has not ended, and the government in Tripoli needed defending from the Libyan National Army, a faction which has the backing of Russia, Egypt, and the wealthy United Arab Emirates. If the LNA were to win, the agreement Ankara and Tripoli struck would be voided. Therefore, Turkish elements successfully defended the capital of Tripoli from the LNA and forced it to abandon northwestern Libya. Recently, the deployment of Turkish military to Libya has been extended until at least 2026. Don't be surprised if it lasts indefinitely. One of the ways Turkey dispatched the LNA forces was through the use of its drones, and this proved a preview for things to come later in the year, when conflict erupted between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Turkey's supply of these drones to the Azerbaijanis, who are also ethnically Turkish people, proved the decisive factor in the war. Azerbaijan's victory increased Turkish influence in the area, and in 2022, Ankara and Baku signed a defense cooperation agreement. Turkish military personnel have been in Azerbaijan ever since, training and advising their Azerbaijani counterparts and gaining access to an airbase there. The infrastructure in Azerbaijan allows Turkey to further project power into the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea. This is strategic real estate for Turkey's Middle Corridor, which is in some ways its own version of China's Belt and Road Initiative. It aims to connect China to Europe through its territory. In addition to the burgeoning presence of its soldiers, sailors, and airmen, Turkey has emerged as one of the world's leading arms dealers over the last decade. As of 2023, Turkey was ranked 11th in the list of top arms exporting countries, with 1.6% of the global market share. This is obviously small, but Turkey's growth in the market has been explosive, increasing by 170% between 2014 and 18, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Over the past decade, Turkish arms exports have had a faster growth rate than any other country. Saudi Arabia, which otherwise has tensions with Turkey, is nevertheless one of its biggest arms customers, showing how good Turkey has become in walking complicated geopolitical tightropes. Turkey's Bayraktar TB2 drone in particular has proven a popular export item, and Ankara is attempting to create more domestic military products. These include a domestic air defense system to replace the Russian S-400, which it found less than satisfactory. It also includes a new fighter jet, the TAI TF Khan. Turkey claims the Khan is a fifth-generation fighter. Although the aircraft missed the desired 2023 date for its maiden flight, Ankara still intends for it to replace the F-16s in its fleet between 2030 and 35, and it could prove a popular item for international export. Arms sales fuel Turkey's ability to further develop domestic weapons, enriching its coffers, which in turn can be spent on strengthening its own military. Turkey is much more powerful than it was at the turn of the century, but its rise as a regional military power has brought it into tension with its NATO allies. This tension escalated to a full-scale naval standoff with Greece in 2020 over hydrocarbon reserves near Greek islands off the coast of Turkey that each of the two countries claimed as their own. Turkey has also played both sides of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine has famously used Turkish drones like the Bayraktar TB2, and Turkey has closed the Dardanelles and Bosporus to Russian naval reinforcements. However, Turkey has also not imposed sanctions on Russia for its invasion, like the rest of its NATO allies have. As noted, Turkey has also purchased Russian equipment like the S-400 air defense system, in a deal which saw Washington exclude it from the F-35 program. Turkish purchases of Russian energy in particular have proven critical in making up for some of the lost trade with the European Union. There may also be greater ambitions for Turkey's recent deployments. Some observers have wondered whether Erdogan has ambitions to create a neo-Ottoman sphere of influence. In many ways, Erdogan is more similar to Putin and Xi Jinping than he is to his NATO allies. Under him, Turkey has become more authoritarian and arguably less Western. One of the best-known cultural expressions of this transition came in 2020, when the Hagia Sophia was consecrated once again as a mosque. Mustafa Kemal had converted the building into a museum as part of his push to secularize and westernize Turkey, but Erdogan wished to see it become a mosque again. Erdogan's decision might be seen as symbolic of his aspiration to leadership not just for Turkey, but as the leader of all Sunni Muslims, a position the Ottoman sultans traditionally claimed for themselves. As early as 2016, Turkish state media began releasing maps that showed the country's borders expanding into northern Syria and Iraq, stretching from the Mediterranean to the border with Iran. Part of Armenia was also included within these borders. Around the same time, Erdogan criticized the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, which established Turkey's modern, post-Ottoman borders. These actions and Erdogan's foreign policy have led some geopolitical experts to believe that he, like Putin, Xi and other leaders such as India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, considers Turkey as a civilization state. In this view of the world order, values such as democracy, the rule of law, and the right of each state to sovereignty and territorial integrity are cast as Western ideas, with no claim to universal legitimacy. Shared attributes like language, ethnicity, and cultural traditions matter more in this view of the world. The state has the obligation to protect these things and all of the people tied to them. The historical status of many of these areas as being in the Ottoman Empire, including as far away as Libya, likely informs part of Erdogan's worldview. Turkey was long one of the great powers of Europe and the Middle East. At its height in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south to the Danube and Crimea in the north. However, it entered a period of decline and was called the sick man of Europe in the 19th century, before collapsing in the aftermath of World War I. Turkey's current deployments are far from the dominion it enjoyed during the Ottoman Empire, but its military build-up and reach is now the greatest it's seen since the old empire collapsed, with no plans of stopping soon. Western influence in the Middle East and Africa is declining, and China is experiencing growing internal problems that have decreased its investments too. Turkey, with its still growing population, is eager to fill this void. But will it? Will Erdogan succeed in creating a neo-Ottoman state of affairs in the region? What tension will his ambitions create within NATO in the years to come? As Russian troops march into Ukraine and the world tries to come to grips with Vladimir Putin's latest show of aggression, a move he dubs a special military operation rather than an invasion or annexation, an extremely strange music video appears on YouTube. A little over 2 minutes long, the video offers up a rather jaunty tune over the footage of soldiers and military equipment. When translated, the video's lyrics say the following: "The occupiers came to us in Ukraine with brand new uniforms and military vehicles, but their inventory melted into steel. Bayraktar." Bayraktar? What does that even mean? But then it appears, a crosshair. Moments later, the footage shows an explosion of dust and debris directly below the crosshair. That explosion is accompanied by that word again, Bayraktar, and it's that word that clues us into what we're really watching. The footage comes from a Bayraktar TB2 drone and shows how Ukraine used this powerful unmanned flying weapon to wreak devastation on the first soldiers who invaded the country. But the Bayraktar TB2 isn't a drone of Ukrainian make. It's actually Turkish, and it stands as perhaps the most obvious sign that Turkey is well on its way to becoming one of the most militarily advanced countries. That growth is fueled, at least in part, by the production of drones such as the Bayraktar TB2. And in this video, we're going to explore how Turkey has developed the world's largest army of drones, both for itself and others, over the last 2 decades. Let's start with the obvious question: just how many drones does Turkey actually have? Though the exact number varies depending on source, according to the National Interest, Turkey currently operates a total of around 130 armed drones, split between various models of the Bayraktar TB2, Anka, and Karayel, which it's been using to target fighters who are loyal to Syria and its president Bashar al-Assad. The European Forum on Armed Drones, or EFA drones, a civil network that tracks the proliferation of drone manufacture and use throughout Europe, provides a similar number, estimating that Turkey has between 92 and 94 of the Bayraktar TB2 drones shown destroying Russian forces in the aforementioned music video, along with 22 of the Anka drones mentioned by the National Interest. It doesn't speculate on the Karayel though. Comparing these numbers to those from the National Interest would suggest that Turkey has at least a dozen of these powerful unmanned fighting systems. But even a casual observer may see 130 drones and assume that Turkey doesn't have the largest drone army in the world, especially when compared to the United States, which far outpaces Turkey in drone usage. In fact, according to the US Department of Defense, it has over 11,000 unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS, in circulation, which far outweighs Turkey's numbers. So then why are we talking about Turkish drones? Because there's a twist. While Turkey itself may not have the largest army of armed drones, it has built the largest army. It's not just keeping all of these drones for itself. Before we dig deeper into that topic though, we need to look at the 3 drones that form the backbone of Turkey's massive drone manufacturing industry. We'll start with the star of the show, at least in Ukraine, the Bayraktar TB2. With a nearly 40-foot wingspan and 21-foot length, the Bayraktar TB2 looks more like a fighter jet than it does the small drones that many people picture when they hear the term drone. And it's an absolute powerhouse when it comes to flight. The TB2 can reach a maximum ceiling of 27,000 feet, though its operational altitude is still an impressive 18,000 feet, and it's capable of flying for up to 27 hours before it needs to return to base for a refill of its 300-liter fuel tank. And it can even operate without direct ground controls when needed. The Bayraktar TB2 can take off and land autonomously, in addition to flying automatically to its target thanks to a triple redundant autopiloting system that operates using a multi-sensor fusion architecture. That means no GPS is required, and the drone can reach its target even in situations where traditional satellites are down. Add to all of that its impressive weapon systems. The TB2 has a payload capacity of around 330 pounds, with that payload typically comprising 4 laser-guided smart munitions. Those are usually the Roketsan MAM-L, a 48-pound rocket with a warhead that's capable of piercing the armor of battle tanks and light armored vehicles, or the Roketsan MAM-C. Both are devastating weapons that fragment upon impact, obliterating any troops unfortunate enough to be in their blast zones, while they also tear away at the armor found on tanks and many military vehicles. And all of that firepower is delivered without having to place a pilot at any physical risk. Then there's the Anka-S. Though not the only Anka drone that's part of Turkey's military, the Anka-S may well be the most impressive of that particular line. The national interest says that it's roughly equivalent to America's Reaper drones, which are larger variations of the famous Predators that the US has used regularly since the 2010s and into the 2020s. Developed in 2013, though only flying for the first time 3 years later, the Anka-S costs around $26 to $29 million and is even larger than the Bayraktar TB2 thanks to its 57.5-foot wingspan. That increased size manifests in a bigger payload too, with the Anka-S being capable of carrying up to 440 pounds of munitions. Like its smaller cousin, the Anka-S can operate autonomously without the need for direct ground control or GPS. Instead, it uses a combination of radars, including a synthetic aperture radar or SAR, a ground-moving target indicator or GMTI, and an inverse SAR to identify and fly towards targets on the ground. Beyond the Roketsan MAM-L, the drone can also carry 2.75-inch Sirit-guided rockets that are more than a match for military shelters, light armored vehicles, and similar targets. It can operate for slightly less time than the Bayraktar TB2, being capable of staying airborne for 24 hours instead of 27, but it has a higher flight ceiling of 30,000 feet. Combine the Bayraktar TB2 with the Anka-S and you have a lethal tag team that's capable of causing serious problems for all but the most well-protected vehicles and fortified locations on the ground. But what if we make this tag team into a trio? Enter the Vestel Karayel. Manufactured by the Turkish arms company Lentatech, the Karayel had its maiden flight in April 2014 and occupies something of a middle ground between the TB2 and the Anka-S. When equipped with a payload, it can stay airborne for 20 hours, which is a bit less than Turkey's other main armored drones. However, it has a slightly more impressive payload capacity than the TB2, thanks to it being capable of carrying rockets both under its wings and at its center of gravity. Combined, those options allow the Karayel to carry 418 pounds of explosive destruction. It can operate at an altitude of 22,500 feet, again higher than the Bayraktar TB2, though a little less than the Anka-S, and comes with the same triple redundant architecture that allows it to take off, land, and track targets without a human directly controlling the drone. Add infrared capabilities into the mix, which are also present in Turkey's other main drones, and devastating smart ammo and laser-guided missiles, and you have a worthy addition to Turkey's drone fleet. Any army in the world would welcome just one of these terrifying drones into the fold, but the firepower the 3 combined offer is the real reason why Turkey has built the world's largest drone army and why it's been exporting them for at least a decade to other countries as it tries to strengthen its military in the face of threats from both Syria and Russia. A December 2023 article published by the International Crisis Group, or ICG, digs deeper into the sheer volume of drone exports for which Turkey is currently responsible. It says that Turkey's drone production is predominantly fueled by private companies, which have collectively provided drones to at least 26 states outside of Turkey as of December 2023. A further 7 are awaiting delivery of drones from Turkey, bringing the total number of countries supplied up to 33, with another 8 having expressed interest in buying drones without making a full commitment. There's clearly money to be made from an army of drones. That number has basically been confirmed by Selçuk Bayraktar, the CEO of major Turkish drone makers Baykar Technologies, who says that his company has exported drones to 33 other countries. Chief among the products sent over is the drone that carries Selçuk's name, the very Bayraktar TB2 that Ukraine used to cause so many problems for Russia in the early stages of the war. This level of drone production is so substantial that it's led to Turkey's total defense exports rocketing up over the last few years. In 2022, a year in which many Western arms manufacturers saw their revenues shrink, according to the ICG, Turkish defense companies actually saw their revenues rise by 22% over the previous year. That included a massive $4.3 billion in drone exports, which accounts for about 10% of Turkey's defense budget and is a higher figure than the entire defense budgets of many smaller nations. With 2023 came another significant bump, with the Turkish defense industry recording $5.5 billion in sales, a 27.1% increase over 2022, with $719.1 million of exports in December of 2023 alone. That was slightly below the $6 billion target that the Turkish defense and aerospace industry set for itself, but it still represents a significant increase and demonstrates how Turkey's drone production is much more than a defensive measure for the country. It's a major moneymaker. And these increases in exports are indicative of a pattern we've seen in Turkey for at least the last half a decade. According to CNBC, Turkey has been cleverly positioning itself as a defense exporter, with drones serving as the linchpin of that burgeoning industry. The country's defense exports rose by 42% between 2020 and 21, with contracts with foreign countries accounting for up to 90% of the revenues for some Turkish defense companies. All of these figures raise 2 more questions though. First, why is Turkey focusing so intently on drone production? And, just as importantly, what kicked it all off? We'll tackle the second question first. It all started in the early 2000s, when the Turkish government developed a plan. Back then, Turkey wasn't exporting much when it came to the defense industry. In fact, it was little more than a minor arms importer. The country had no real defense industry to call its own, leading to it buying most of the equipment it needed, but the early 2000s brought with it a concerted effort to achieve defense modernization, with the goal of becoming a self-sustaining military nation being right at the top of the agenda. And by 2004, Turkey had made a real statement of intent in this regard. Its Executive Committee of Defense Industries cancelled several equipment acquisition projects valued at a total of $11 billion, and the message was clear: they wouldn't rely on overseas weapons anymore. Instead, Turkey's own manufacturers should focus on developing the country's warfighting assets. The Atlantic Council says that what followed has been almost 2 decades of industrial transformation that's seen Turkey's military-industrial capabilities enjoy consistent and steady growth. It points to a strategy document released by Turkey's defense industry just prior to 2018 as a perfect example of the country's new approach. That document outlines the collective industry's involvement in more ambitious projects between 2018 and 22, with drone manufacturing being a large part of that involvement and setting a sky-is-the-limit goal for the industry. Nothing was off the table, and there were no bad ideas as long as they could contribute to Turkey's defense industry growth. It's all in service of Turkey building a self-sustaining defense industry that not only keeps the country well armed in case it ever needs to defend itself, but also provides a consistent revenue stream that further funds its ability to arm itself. An update to that document covering 2019 to 23 built on this sky's-the-limit concept. It did so by laying out plans for developing an elite workforce that would be the brains behind a technological transformation that will protect this burgeoning industry in the years to come. The Atlantic Council points to Turkey's focus on drones as being a product of these modernization efforts, and we've now seen the result with the Bayraktar TB2 being a major player in the war between Russia and Ukraine. However, Turkey's efforts aren't solely restricted to drones. According to the organization, Turkey has also played a large role in helping Ukraine to rebuild its navy, which could prove vital in defending itself via the Black Sea in the future. Those contributions include working on new Ada-class Milgem corvettes with the Ukrainians. Add to that Turkey supplying the Ukrainian army with some of its own Kirpi mine-resistant and ambush-protecting fighting vehicles, and you can clearly see how Turkey is now positioning itself on the geopolitical scale. It's no longer a consumer, it's a supplier, and one that has major influence in times of war. And that influence leads us back to the earlier question that we asked about Turkey, its drone production, and its focus on military modernization in general. Why is it happening? We already have two of our answers, money and influence, but there's more to it than that. Making and breaking records in defense exports, again, heavily fueled by drone production, isn't just a point of pride for Turkey, it's extremely practical. We can see this in the country's October 2023 announcement that it would pump 150% more cash into its own defense budget in 2024 compared to how much it spent in 2023. According to Reuters, the country spent $16 billion on defense and security in 2023. That number could rise to as much as $40 billion in 2024, which likely would not have been possible were it not for the increased exports of equipment of which Turkey is now capable of producing. In that same announcement, Turkey's Vice President, Cevdet Yilmaz, also noted that the government has massively increased its projections for defense industry exports. The target rose from $6 billion, which Turkey was just shy of in 2023, to $11 billion. Another statement of intent. Yilmaz also said the defense industry as a whole was inching closer to full self-sufficiency, with 2023 seeing the country become 80% self-sufficient, with the next target being 85%. Then there's the influence issue. Turkey has faced a handful of problems in its efforts to import new weapons into the country since 2017, with most of these problems coming from the US. That year brought Turkey being snubbed from America's F-35 joint program, with Reuters pointing out that Turkey's decision to buy a Russian-made S-400 missile system likely being the cause. America also blocked a $20 billion deal Turkey attempted to make with Lockheed Martin to export F-16 fighter jets. This was seen as a response to Turkey attempting to block Sweden from joining NATO, as well as to President Tayyip Erdogan's record on human rights and encroachments into Greek airspace. Add to that several countries, including France and Germany, placing unofficial military embargoes on Turkey due to its military operations in Syria in recent years, and you have a country that's on a precarious geopolitical footing. Enter Turkey's drone army. The country's sales of drones have helped it to establish stronger relationships with many of its neighbors and nearby countries, essentially helping it to build a collection of allies while it faces condemnation from some Western nations. Ukraine is the obvious highlight of this relationship building, if a YouTube music video turning the Bayraktar TB2 into an early icon of the country's war with Russia is anything to go by. Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Kyrgyzstan are all on that list, with Turkey also having managed to strengthen its ties with major military players like Saudi Arabia and Poland through its drone production. It all adds up to the bolstering of Turkish influence in Europe and many of the Gulf states. CNBC points out that we saw that influence in full force during the 2023 International Defense Exhibition, or IDEX. Often referred to as the Middle East's largest arms fair, IDEX featured a heavy Turkish presence. CNBC goes as far as to claim that Turkey was impossible to miss. This is thanks to its massive branded pavilions that showcase everything from assault rifles and armored trucks to the drones that have allowed the country to develop such a powerful influence in the Gulf region. Alper Oziblen, the chairman of a Turkish defense company named Pavo Group, made that clear when he told CNBC that there is significant international demand from the Middle East, from Asia, and from Europe. He also pointed out that Turkish companies are doing their best to provide drones and land platforms to Ukraine, with the use of that equipment showcasing that Turkish products have now been proven mature enough for use in war. Our clients, our partners, are very happy, continued Oziblen. And that happiness is key to Turkey's strategy for developing its drone army. It places it in a prime position to benefit from countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, or UAE, all of which are bolstering their own defense industries amidst rising instability in the Middle East. Several Turkish companies have already inked partnership deals with these oil-rich states, which has been good news for Turkey. For instance, Saudi Arabia deposited $5 billion into Turkey's central bank in March 2023 via its Saudi Fund for Development. That decision, according to a statement from Saudi Arabia, was made to show continued support for Turkey as it attempts to bolster its economy. Meanwhile, the UAE signed multiple agreements across the defense, cultural, and commercial sectors with Turkey in 2022. Once again, this showcases how Turkey is using its drone production to curry favor with potential partners in the Middle East. It all adds up to a we'll scratch your back if you scratch ours strategy. Turkey sells arms, drones being chief among them, to these Gulf states, and it reaps the rewards in terms of financial incentives and increased influence within those states. And it's not the end of Turkey's attempts to curry favor and gain influence. We mentioned earlier that Turkey made some of its NATO partners uneasy when it opposed Sweden's entry into the military partnership, chief among them being the United States. But even amidst that unease, Turkey has managed to establish itself as a major player in the group thanks to its drone and weapon production. CNBC points out that Turkey now has the second largest military among the NATO nations, with only the United States having a larger fighting force. However, it also highlights that many of the NATO members, especially those in Europe, are starting to run low on military equipment as a result of their rush to help Ukraine in its war with Russia. And who's helping those countries replenish their stocks? Turkey. Some of the country's defense manufacturers say that they're booked for the next several years at least, with orders from European partners in NATO that seem designed to help them replenish their stocks. Emin Oner, who's the chairman of Turkish defense manufacturer Asan Group, also points out that it's not just the NATO countries that actively participate in the Ukraine war by sending equipment over that are placing orders. Other European countries are buying from Turkey as well. They're looking to stockpile, with Oner claiming that his company has shifts running around the clock to keep up with the volume of orders it's received from its European clients. Add to all of that, Turkey playing a somewhat dangerous balancing game. While it's happy to make its dealings with Ukraine in public, it's less transparent about its relationship with Russia. After all, we know that Turkey created tension with the US with order of missile systems from Russia. Plus, the country has opened itself up to some Russians who are trying to escape Western sanctions, to the point where the United States threatened further sanctions that would hit financial firms doing business with Russia in February 2024. That's no surprise. According to Le Monde, 5,000 Russians bought property in Turkey between February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and June 2022, with June alone seeing 1,275 purchases. Why did that happen? The simple answer is that anybody who buys a property worth $400,000 or more in Turkey automatically receives citizenship to the country, a nice little loophole that allows Russians affected by Western sanctions to continue making money. So we can see America's threats of more sanctions as a move designed to cool relationships between Turkey and Russia, all of which brings us back to Turkey's massive army of armed drones. Those drones represent so much more than the strength they provide to Turkey's own military. While the country is clearly using those drones to position itself as a threat and to bolster its defenses if it gets dragged into a conflict, the country's drone manufacturing serves a far bigger purpose. It's an economic boon for Turkey, one that's allowing it to build stronger relationships with Gulf countries that have already started to have a positive economic impact. Turkey's drones are also a tool of influence, as seen by those Gulf relationships, as well as Turkey becoming a major arms supplier inside NATO and being heralded for providing Bayraktar TB2 drones to Ukraine. It all adds up to Turkey using its drones, as well as the increased production of other equipment stemming from its military modernization, to become a major player on the geopolitical stage. But at the same time, it's engaging in that dangerous balancing act by maintaining relationships with Russia even as it becomes a bigger military player in the Western world. The question now is, will Turkey, powered by its increasingly large drone army, manage to sustain its military modernization and continue its ascent to becoming one of the foremost geopolitical players in Europe? But what do you think about Turkey's ascension as a military power thanks in large part to its drones? Will the same trends continue, or is this going to turn into a dead-end route for them?
From the war in Ukraine to the growing conflict in Israel, the battlefield is constantly changing. New weapons continue to roll off the assembly line, and politics becomes more convoluted every day. In the past, NATO has been a champion of peace, unity, and democracy worldwide. Emerging victorious from the Cold War, its role has shifted, with some people questioning its place on the world stage. Do NATO's weaknesses outweigh its strengths? Let's talk about it. But we need to start with a little context first. Both of the world wars were destructive on an almost biblical level, and out of the ashes, people were left with a feeling of never again. But post-World War II, the world's political situation was a little complicated. The Soviet Union, once a friend to the Western powers and a crucial ally in defeating Nazi Germany, now found themselves at odds over who controlled what in Europe. As things spiraled out of control and tensions escalated, it became more apparent to the US, UK, and other Western countries that something needed to be done to ensure their hard-won peace continued. And thus, NATO was founded. Established in 1949 with the hope of preserving peace in Europe, it aimed to deter the Soviet threat that loomed over the land. It's designed to operate primarily as a defensive alliance. If an outside party attacked any of the member nations, then all of the nations of NATO would respond in force. Paradoxically, nothing guarantees peace quite like the promise of extreme violence. But how big of a guarantee was this? Since 1949, NATO has seen its membership grow to 31 countries around Europe and 40 additional partner countries globally. While not full members, the partner countries and NATO work together to achieve shared goals of peace and prosperity. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, its role changed significantly. NATO forces undertook significant combat operations for the first time in the Bosnian War in the mid-90s, the Kosovo War in the late 90s, and continued to expand its capabilities with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. After the September 11th attacks, something big happened. Article 5 of the NATO Charter was invoked for the first time and only time in the organization's history. This called on all members of the alliance to consider the attack on the United States as an attack on all of them. This acceleration in military operations did not slow down after that, and NATO found itself even further involved in conflicts throughout the Middle East. But why is NATO's involvement or non-involvement in these and similar conflicts so crucial? What exactly are its main strengths? First and foremost, NATO's greatest asset, and the main idea behind its founding, is deterrence and defense through strength in unity. All for one and one for all, as the saying goes. The Soviet Union had emerged from World War II as a military and industrial juggernaut. Their nuclear arms program, armed forces, and the military-industrial complex on the home front had turned it from a struggling country with strange political ideas to a heavyweight fighter who was ready to square up with the best the US had to offer. The idea of strength through unity worked well enough to keep Soviet tanks from rolling through West Germany, extinguish the always resurgent flames of nationalism, and avoid Europe becoming a nuclear wasteland all throughout the Cold War. As NATO expanded to countries in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and even as far east as Turkey, untold number of regional conflicts were avoided and peace largely reigned. No one dared attack a member of NATO because if they did, they knew they'd have American-made fiery precision burning their house down faster than thought possible. Say what you will about the US, but when it comes to making weapons, it really is second to none. Possessing some of the finest weaponry in the world and also working together as a unified team spells power. In Afghanistan, for instance, the NATO forces were made up of troops from every member nation, with the overall commander position being occupied by a revolving door of generals from multiple nations. With a unified command structure for all the NATO forces involved, their mission was clear and concise, ready to strike as a cohesive unit. All of this cohesion has many benefits as the world continues to evolve and the political and military landscape shifts. With new technology and new weapons always being produced, NATO stands ready to adapt to new threats. Protection against cyber attacks, for example, is a key part of NATO's defense and deterrence plan and is becoming increasingly vital. Cooperative security is absolutely crucial here, as nations need to work together to mitigate the ever-changing and complex cyber attacks that are being employed. This idea goes beyond cybersecurity and really applies to all facets of NATO's defense. Without coordinated efforts and training, the alliance would be extremely vulnerable to threats. But for all of its highbrow ideals and extravagant plans, NATO has some glaring weaknesses that could prove disastrous if a few things don't go their way. As the list of NATO members grows longer and many smaller Eastern European countries are brought into the fold, you would think that this means an even more secure peace, but that might not necessarily be the case. As NATO inches further eastward, what has really happened is it has backed the Russian bear into a corner, the results of which might doom the world. But before we get into that, let's take a quick trip back to the 90s. A great time for grunge and low-waisted pants, not so much for anyone living in post-Soviet Union Russia, where political and economic turmoil left the country like a ship without a rudder. The breakup of the Soviet Union left a lot of questions to be answered about the borders of Eastern Europe and the expansion of NATO. During negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1990, the US made assurances to their Russian counterparts that with the reunification of Europe, NATO would not expand its membership to Moscow's doorstep. Both sides came away satisfied with the progress they had made and called it a day. Like any good politician, the US and NATO immediately went back on their word and began the process of expanding eastward. As you might have guessed, this enraged Moscow, who claimed that NATO had broken its agreement and done exactly the opposite of what it had promised. NATO simply shrugged and said we didn't have anything in writing, so get over it. Russia during the 90s and 2000s was very vulnerable, and they were still picking up the pieces of their broken empire, so they were in no place to put up too much of an argument, but they never forgot. As each US president since 1990 has advanced NATO's boundaries eastward, tensions have skyrocketed and finally exploded with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Potential NATO expansion into Ukraine is one of Putin's key justifications for starting the war. In March of 2022, President Joe Biden vowed to defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of its collective power. But what if certain NATO members break formation and want to attempt negotiation rather than fight? All it really takes is instability of some kind to take hold in a few countries for Putin to gamble that the reward outweighs the risk, and that's exactly what NATO has been afraid of. With the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, NATO has been paralyzed by fear of antagonizing Putin and has, whenever possible, tried to steer clear of his way. Putin knew the advantage he had and acted accordingly. Several countries, including Germany and Turkey, have significant economic relations with Russia, and this leverage caused them to hesitate and not react decisively as a cohesive group. Up until the launching of the invasion of Ukraine, Germany was one of Russia's biggest trading partners on the continent, and even imported 50 to 70% of its natural gas from them. Turkey also benefited greatly from their trade with Russia, with the trade volume between the two countries being worth around $26 billion in 2019. Even with the invasion of Ukraine, this deep-seated division over how to deal with Russian aggression reared its ugly head. No significant NATO aid was delivered to Ukraine before the invasion, and there was even hesitation in the immediate aftermath. If NATO had taken preemptive action and cooperated with each other, there is a chance Ukraine could have struck a decisive blow early on, but sadly we'll never know. Most NATO members don't exactly have the strongest militaries, so if the alliance was in jeopardy, some countries, the Baltic ones especially, would be cannon fodder for the Russian war machine. Knowing full well that they would be on the front line, would countries like Latvia or Lithuania stand up and fight, or just roll over and let Russia walk on in? American firepower is a hell of a deterrent, but a lot could happen before the cavalry could ride to the rescue. No one could say for certain what will happen until they hear those T-90s rumbling in the distance. Even Europe's supposed military superpowers, the UK, France, and Germany, have let their militaries atrophy ever since the Cold War, with a brief resurgence with their involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, but then right back to letting them waste away. Their troop numbers and available resources hardly leave them able to effectively fight a ground war against a major military power anytime soon. The British military, for instance, is at its smallest size since they were fighting Napoleon with flintstock muskets and swords. Yep, you heard that right. Overextending themselves into unstable territory is a massive risk for NATO, as the chance of getting pulled into armed conflict continues to climb. At the end of the day, troop and resource commitment by NATO members is voluntary, so if Estonia or the Czech Republic, for example, decides not to honor the agreement, it may have a domino effect, leaving the US holding the bag, even more than it already is. That leads us to another massive weakness in NATO's defense plan. As it currently stands, the United States covers about 2/3 of NATO defense spending. 2/3. For reference, NATO defense spending in 2022 totaled around $1 trillion. 2/3 of that is roughly $660 billion. Having 2/3 of your eggs in one metaphorical basket is pretty much never a good idea. What if something happened and the US could no longer contribute as much money and resources to the NATO defense budget? As unlikely as it seems for the US to stop producing outrageous amounts of weapons, or for the economy to take a nosedive, crazier things have happened. In 2006, the NATO defense ministers agreed that 2% of each country's GDP should be put towards collective defense spending. Year after year, most of the countries fall laughably short. In 2022, only the US, Estonia, Greece, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and the United Kingdom hit the mark. So it's safe to say that without US assistance, NATO would be about as effective as the Postal Service would be if they had to go back to using horses. The over-reliance on US manpower and resources for protection could seriously come back to haunt NATO. Controlling a large majority of the defense budget gives them a tremendous amount of leverage to theoretically direct NATO where they want it to go. The US is currently the majority supplier of arms and ammunition to Ukraine. As of September 2023, over $46 billion has been sent to Ukraine in the shape of weapons, ammunition, logistical and security training, support equipment, and loans to go and buy more stuff. The aid is proving to be crucial to the Ukrainian resistance, as they doggedly defend every trench line and outpost against the Russian behemoth. Its weapons like the Javelin and Stinger missiles are giving the Ukrainians an edge against the Russians. These mobile weapon systems allow soldiers to pick off Russian armor and aircraft and retreat into the trees unseen. Seems like the Russians learned nothing from their time in Afghanistan. Now, while most would probably agree that helping Ukraine is a positive thing, you have to look at the balance of aid being given. The amount of US aid being given is over double that of the closest European powers, that being Germany and the UK. The fact of the matter is the US is better equipped and more proficient at producing weapons and other war supplies than the rest of NATO because they have been at war for the past 20 years. It's not that Germany, Italy, or the UK don't have assault rifles and tanks. They do have lots of them, but only enough of them to supply their own armies. That's why Ukraine did not receive its shipment of Leopard tanks from Germany until over a year into the invasion. They simply did not have enough to spare. With the NATO scales so heavily tilted in the US's favor, you have to question if this alliance is actually fair and equal as it claims to be, or do the other NATO members go along with whatever the US wants just to maintain the status quo? While the US certainly profits tremendously from trading with a peaceful Europe, war has always proven to be a huge moneymaker for the ones who produce the weapons. Further militarization of Europe only benefits the US. This leverage that the US holds over NATO further cements American influence in Europe, and that influence is going to keep growing as long as the balance of power remains that way. In 2020, the US and Poland signed an agreement that allowed 10,000 US troops to be stationed on Polish soil, acting as a boots-on-the-ground check to Russian aggression in the region. The US military is also in the process of opening some bases in Romania, hoping to extend NATO naval reach to the Black Sea. The US has taken a similar approach to combating the threat posed by China, with multiple bases around the Pacific. These bases in the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, etc., give the US the ability to counter a Chinese attack and provide logistical support at incredible speeds. With this much of a presence and a tremendous amount of influence in the region, NATO better hope and pray that the US remains peaceful and on the defensive. Another potential problem for NATO that has been gaining traction in recent years is that of the changes in public opinion. Now, while most citizens in NATO countries have a positive opinion of the alliance, there is a slightly growing dissent amongst Americans as to the effectiveness and relevance of NATO. This goes back to the whole "don't keep 2/3 of your eggs in a metaphorical basket" thing. If the US was to reduce its support for NATO and/or Ukraine, the consequences could spell disaster for Europe and maybe even the world. As unlikely as this is, politics is an unpredictable game. NATO's extreme reliance on American funding and support leaves them vulnerable to a variety of problems that could arise. This is an issue that will be discussed at length in every presidential election to come and will grow in the minds of its citizens as the war in Ukraine deepens. The most dangerous threat to NATO, however, might come from inside its own alliance. Ever since Turkish President Erdogan has been in office, Turkey has acted essentially in its own self-interest, with little regard for how its actions affect the rest of NATO. Always the political wild card, Turkey knows how to keep things interesting. Turkey joined NATO during the height of the Cold War in 1952, hoping for protection from a potential Soviet invasion across the Straits of the Dardanelles. Turkey had been applying for NATO membership for years and was only accepted when the US and other NATO members realized the defensive value they would have in the event of Soviet aggression. Since Turkey gained membership, it's proved itself to be a valuable member of the alliance, as they possess the second largest military behind the United States and possess multiple important military bases, including the Incirlik and Konya air bases. From an economic perspective, Turkey has the potential to be a major player on the world stage. It's the 19th largest economy in the world and has a GDP of $906 billion. Employing ambitious reforms from 2006 to 2017, Turkey saw income rates rise and widespread poverty reduction. While economic growth has stalled as of late, the potential is still there. The area around the Sea of Marmara is also an extremely valuable resource for Turkey, NATO, and the world. This area is rich in agricultural land and is also home to some of the most profitable and important trade routes in the world. It's very clear why, from both a military and economic perspective, Turkey is such a valuable member of the alliance. But that doesn't mean its membership has all been smooth sailing. With such a wide variety of countries in NATO, it's always possible that one of them could step out of line and do something to strain the unity of the alliance. Turkey continues to find itself in regional conflicts with its neighbors or groups close to the region. The longest-running conflict it's still fighting is without a doubt with the Kurdish people. For reference, the Kurds are an ethnic group who reside in parts of Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, and their population numbers around 30 to 40 million. They have been fighting this bloody war with Turkey since 1978, and no end is in sight. This conflict especially complicates things for Turkey, as killing Kurds will only alienate them from the United States. The Kurds and the US have had a relationship going back decades now, and the Kurds have served as an important partner for US interests in the region, most recently in the fight against ISIS. In 2017, the UN expressed concern about the Turkish treatment of Kurds, but nothing was actually done about it. In the same year, the US attempted to supply Kurdish forces with weapons, but Turkey objected, claiming that doing so violated NATO rules. Turkey claims that the Kurds are nothing more than terrorists and want to wipe them out, but the US claims that the Kurds have been their partners for years and are not terrorists. So while men in suits debate this and make eloquent arguments in fancy rooms, the brutal truth is that people on the ground are going to keep getting killed until NATO can figure out what side of the fence it's on. Besides Turkey's ongoing saber-rattling with the Kurds, they continue to be problematic neighbors for the rest of the Middle East and Europe. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Turkey unequivocally supported Ukraine and pledged to support them militarily for the duration of the war. This show of unity with the rest of NATO was not out of the goodness of their heart, but a strategic one. They could not allow Russia to control any more of the Black Sea and shift the balance of power in the region. While not a surprising move, it might be worth keeping an eye on Turkey throughout the duration of the conflict. Another area in which Turkey is becoming increasingly problematic for NATO is the fact that they have backslid from a budding democracy to an increasingly authoritarian regime under President Erdogan. He continues to crush any opposition to his rule and consolidate his power, including making changes to Turkey's parliamentary system to benefit him and his party. Turkey has also suppressed freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and removed the checks and balances that are a staple of true democracies. They have even gone as far as jailing political opponents, journalists, and anyone who is in favor of dissent. This regression has of course harmed the citizens of Turkey the most, as state institutions are eroded and the economy loses momentum. The final nail in the democratic coffin seemingly occurred with their last election in May of 2023, where President Erdogan was re-elected in what almost certainly were not free or fair elections. Going more toward authoritarianism is extremely troubling to NATO, as this goes against one of the pillars of the alliance, that being the promotion of democracy, a value that is supposed to be shared by all members of NATO. So as Turkey becomes more authoritarian, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing down, its relationship with its NATO allies is becoming increasingly strained. For all the headaches they cause their allies, Turkey remains an important part of NATO. Their regional and strategic importance has allowed them to get away with a lot, but at some point will NATO say enough is enough? As Turkey continues to play fast and loose with its foreign policy and continues to act in its own interest, there may come a point where NATO believes their membership cannot be justified anymore. The usual tactic they employ is waiting out problematic leaders and using a combination of political and economic pressure to effect change, but it might not be enough. As it currently stands, there is no mechanism for suspension or expulsion from NATO. However, that does not mean that it theoretically couldn't happen. If Turkey was to take a step too far, NATO could find them in material breach of the treaty and find creative ways to remove them. This is unlikely, as Turkey would have to do something rather extreme, but it's technically possible. Only time will tell, but it looks like as of the production of this video, that Turkey isn't moving in the right direction. Looking at NATO as a whole, there are enough strengths and weaknesses to keep political analysts and the talking heads on TV busy until the end of time. NATO has historically proven that they have been a force for good and have promoted peace and democracy throughout the world. It's not out of line to say that the unity of NATO and its deterrence of the Soviet Union probably helped save the world from nuclear annihilation through mutually assured destruction. Not too shabby. After the resounding victory in the Cold War and the dawn of a new era for NATO, they have adapted to new threats and worked, for the most part, as a cohesive team, ready to face new military, technological, and humanitarian challenges head-on. The world never sits still, and the ever-changing political landscape is seemingly more complicated than ever. NATO's unity and values are going to be continually put to the test as new crises and conflicts arise. Will they close ranks and de-escalate things, or will division and tensions allow the alliance to be dragged into wars that could be their undoing? overextension of the alliance into unstable countries is certainly a risk, as more members of NATO means more potential for conflict to arise. Remember the phrase all for one and one for all. Following its current trend, it also means that the United States is paying the defense bill for a growing list of countries. While this is great for the Americans' weapons manufacturing industry, this over-reliance on American bombs and bullets could prove disastrous if public opinion shifts or some once-in-a-lifetime economic crisis unfolds. However unlikely, it's worth considering. American influence in Europe has grown exponentially since the creation of NATO, and it doesn't seem like it will stop anytime soon. The US continues to build military bases and station troops in Europe, while also being the chief source of all things weapon-related. This gives the US a tremendous amount of influence and leverage over the other members of the alliance. This amount of power requires extremely careful handling going forward. You might want to dig a little deeper when thinking about who to vote for in the next election, my American friends. NATO has its fair share of issues, but debatably the biggest one comes from Turkey. Once a democracy, they have become an authoritative regime that imprisons political opponents and squashes free speech. It continues to act in its own self-interest and stoke the flames of regional conflicts with neighbors. Its involvement in Syria, Libya, and the ongoing campaign against the Kurdish people has only served to create more division in NATO and make people question the true nature of the alliance. As problematic as they are, Turkey remains a powerful ally that sits at the crossroads of the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, and likely won't be going anywhere in the near future. All in all, NATO has its strengths and weaknesses like any organization. Historically, it's carried the torch for the betterment of humanity, but as the world continues to evolve and situations change, will it still be needed?
Spain has had enough. After watching from the sidelines while the West armed Ukraine, Spain has finally decided to take action, and it's sending a brutal message to Russian President Vladimir Putin: get out of Ukraine. This isn't just a routine arms delivery. Spain's new aid package is packed with weapons designed to crush Russian forces and push them back once and for all. The Kremlin is reeling, and Putin's plans are in serious danger. Spain's move could be the tipping point that turns the tide of the war, pushing Putin's invasion to the brink of collapse. In this video, we reveal what Spain is sending and how it's going to help Ukraine deliver a crushing blow to Putin's ambitions. Let's get into it. On March 24, 2024, the Defense Post reported on Spain's announcement that it intended to send 19 of its Leopard 2A4 tanks to Ukraine by September of the same year. The tanks wouldn't simply be pulled out of storage and shipped over. Instead, Spain said it would contact General Dynamics European Land Systems to complete full commissioning services on every tank, giving each Leopard a full overhaul while replacing any defective parts to ensure each tank's systems were fully operational by the time they reached Ukraine. The delivery would be the second Spain would send to Ukraine. The first came in 2023, with Spain donating 6 of its Leopard tanks. With this second batch, Spain would more than quadruple its tank support for Ukraine. Still, as impressive as this announcement was, it represented a fairly small amount of aid being delivered to Ukraine. Almost 20 Leopard 2A4 tanks would certainly be useful from a defensive standpoint, but they wouldn't be enough to help Ukraine turn the tide against the Russian forces that were making a heavy push in Donetsk. But more was to come. 2 months later, on May 27th, Spain decided to double down on this initial show of support. The country's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez sat down with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to sign an agreement that would see Spain deliver an impressive 1 billion euros in aid, roughly translated into $1.08 billion, as part of a pact that sees Spain ally itself with Ukraine for the next decade. It's more important than ever to redouble our support, claimed Sanchez in a press conference following the signing. According to the agreement in question, Spain claims it will provide modern military equipment for ground, sea, aerial, and other uses based on Ukraine's key capacity needs at the time. Interestingly, Spain has also agreed to help Ukraine protect its maritime food export routes, ensuring the country can continue to be the breadbasket of Europe without fear of Russian interference preventing it from shipping through the Black Sea. The question from there was, where would the $1.08 billion be spent? Newsweek offered some answers in a May 27th article, in which it detailed the various weapon systems Spain had committed to delivering. The 19 Leopard tanks pledged to Ukraine back in March were part of that list, as were a dozen of the powerful Patriot anti-aircraft missile systems that Ukraine has been using so well to keep Russia's aerial bombardments at bay. Add ammunition and anti-drone gear to the package, and you have a donation that covers most of the key areas of the war. But Newsweek also delivered a detail that wasn't in the initial Reuters report. Spain had committed to sending a staggering $5.4 billion by the end of 2027, meaning the $1.08 billion in equipment being donated from May 24 would simply be the first in multiple rounds of donations, designed to help Ukraine defend itself and ultimately recover from its war effort. The question now is simple. Why would Spain commit to such an extensive aid package? After all, its history with Russia isn't quite as fraught as that of many other European countries that fear Russian aggression. Spain was never part of the Soviet yoke following World War II, as countries like Poland and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all three being ardent supporters of Ukraine, were. If anything, you could argue that Spain's recent history with Russia has been as close to neutral as it could be, considering Russia's actions in the 20th century through to today in Ukraine. Granted, Moscow played a role in the Spanish Civil War. The Soviet Union offered active support to Spain's Republican factions at the time, sending military advisors, weapons, and volunteer soldiers in exchange for gold drawn out of the Bank of Spain's reserves. However, Spain would eventually come to laud those Soviet volunteers. A monument to them was erected in Madrid in 1989, listing the names of 182 Russian combatants killed during the Civil War. There was just one problem. The Republicans lost the Spanish Civil War to the Nationalists in 1939, meaning all of the Soviet support was for naught. Now under Franco, Spain became an enemy to Russia, with Spain's Blue Division of volunteers fighting against the Soviet Red Army on the Eastern Front for a short period until Franco decided enough was enough. He withdrew the Spanish soldiers, with Spain going on to remain neutral for the rest of World War II. So conflict existed, but Spain and the Soviet Union tended to essentially stay away from one another following World War II. There were signs of tension, such as Nikita Khrushchev claiming that Russia's relationship with Spain was the worst but hardly the most problematic, when speaking in front of the United Nations General Assembly in October 1960, which followed Franco banning a soccer match between Spain and the Soviet Union earlier in the year. But direct conflict between the two was never really an issue, and toward the end of Franco's reign, the relationship between the two countries was even starting to defrost. A trade agreement was signed in 1972, with the Soviet ambassador being appointed to Spain around 5 years later. As the Soviet Union gave way to the Russian Federation in the early 1990s, Spain and Russia continued to have a cordial relationship. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev and Spain's King Juan Carlos I even worked together on issues such as Kosovo, declaring its independence from Serbia. Putin would even visit Spain multiple times in the 2000s. There were a few hiccups along the way, of course, but as recently as 2020, a Russian representative was writing in the margins of the Gaidar Forum that he believed, "There is no reason for our nations to be guided by the politics of others, and we trust that Russian-Spanish relations, with the current government or with any other, have a good future." Then came February 2022, and a true test of that statement. Russia invaded Ukraine, putting all of Europe on notice. Putin was no longer interested in playing politics or being diplomatic. He was going to take what he wanted by force. And like most other European countries, Spain took this action as a direct threat, which has resulted in any true diplomatic ties between Russia and Spain going up in smoke. If you need any evidence of that, you only need to refer to the comments made by Spain's defense minister, Margarita Robles, in March 2024, the same month in which Spain committed its 19 Leopard tanks. Speaking to the Spanish newspaper La Vanguardia, Robles said the situation with Russia was extremely complex, while making sure to point out something that is likely on every Spanish mind: right now, a ballistic missile could easily reach Spain from Russia. She continued, calling the threat that Russia poses to the countries that neighbor Ukraine total and absolute. Many of those countries, such as the Baltic states we mentioned earlier, are also NATO members, as is Spain. Reading between the lines of this comment, Robles is clearly stating that any threat to these NATO member countries is also a threat to Spain, not least because Article 5 of the NATO Charter provides that all members of the alliance would come to the aid of any other member state should one be subject to an armed attack. If Putin's ambitions spread to the likes of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, for instance, any invasion he launched into those countries would leave Spain duty-bound to come to their defense. Robles made this even clearer when she said, "You only have to listen to the latest statement from Putin in which he talks about the possibility of nuclear attacks." She points out that the countries close to Russia are already well aware of the danger Putin poses, while those further to the west don't have the awareness that perhaps they need. She went on to call Putin an unscrupulous person. So the reasoning behind Spain delivering such a historic blow to Russia becomes clear. Spain feels threatened. Putin's actions in Ukraine have shown that he's a leader who will not stop in his quest to get what he wants. So rather than leave Ukraine to fend for itself, Spain is making its military donations to bolster Ukraine's defenses to the point where it can stop Putin in his tracks before he turns his attention to the rest of Europe. But let's come back to Spain's military aid to Ukraine. Just how much had it delivered before the announcement of this historic package? As it turns out, not that much. According to Statista, Spain had sent $1.35 billion in aid between February 2022 and June 2024, a figure that includes the $1.08 billion announced in May 2024. So prior to this announcement, Spain had only provided around $280 million, with much of that coming in the form of direct financial aid, barring the 2023 delivery of a handful of Leopard tanks. This lack of aid puts Spain fairly low on the list of countries that have donated to Ukraine. It ranks 17th on the list, well behind other major European powers such as Germany and the United Kingdom, which have both cracked or come close to cracking the $15 billion mark. Granted, Spain is a member of the European Union or EU, and various EU institutions have donated $43.67 billion since the war began. Spain could argue that it will have donated via those institutions, but the fact remains that up until 2024, it had been one of the few major powers not to make an extensive commitment to Ukraine. To expand on that point, we can also look to Statista to explain how much Spain has donated as a share of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP. Then it's even lower on the list, coming in at 27 out of the 38 nations that have donated to Ukraine. Spain has spent just 0.09% of its GDP on providing military aid to Ukraine, meaning one of Europe's richest nations has also been one of the continent's stingiest when it comes to providing aid. For context, the UK has committed 0.45% of its GDP since the Ukraine war began, while the countries that are most under threat should Putin win, contributing considerably more. Estonia's donations, when stacked up against its GDP, come to 1.66%, for instance, with Lithuania landing on 1.43% and Latvia on 1.35%. That information offers much-needed context as to why Spain's most recent donation announcements are such a devastating blow for Putin. For almost the entire Ukraine war, he had been able to rely on Spain to be cautious at best when it came to supporting Ukraine. The country outwardly backed Zelensky, but wasn't following up its verbal support with substantial amounts of money. That's all changed. Over $1 billion worth of equipment will be flowing from Spain and into Ukraine in 2024, with the promise of over $4 billion more to come by 2027. With that, let's move on to an examination of the specific equipment that Spain is sending. We'll start with the Leopard 2A4 tank. The tank is the most common model of the Leopard 2, with its history dating back to West Germany in 1977. It was during that year, at the height of the Cold War, that West German contractor Krauss Maffei Wegmann worked alongside Rheinmetall to fulfill its promise to deliver a successor to the famous Leopard battle tank. A staggering 1,800 of the first Leopard 2 tanks were built in the late 1970s, with the design undergoing several upgrades in the years that followed. The Leopard 2A1 brought with it some minor modifications, including the addition of new ammo racks and a thermal sight for the tank's gunners. As for the 2A2, it upgraded the thermal sight, added a deflector plate for the tank's periscope, and bolstered the Leopard 2's armor with a large cover plate designed to improve the Leopard's protection against nuclear, biological, and chemical attacks. Next up came the 2A3, which implemented SEM8090 digital radio sets along with a new welding technique for the tank's ammo hatches. Finally, we come to the 2A4. Though not the most recent model of the Leopard 2, Germany released the 2A5 through 2A7 models in the years that followed, it is the most widespread and brought with it some wholesale changes to how Leopard tanks were designed. These changes included the installation of an automated fire and explosion suppression system, providing the tank with much-needed protection against the new crop of anti-tank weapons that were appearing in the later 1980s. An improved turret protected by tungsten armor was also added, as was a digital fire control system that made the tank capable of firing more types of ammunition. Let's zero in on that firepower. The Leopard 2A4 kept the L44 120mm smoothbore main gun that was used in the tank's previous iterations, though this older gun was bolstered by the new Digbal digital FCS fire system. That system equips the 2A4 with a ballistic computer that uses motion and environmental sensors, along with a laser rangefinder to identify and track potential targets. A handful of the 2A4 tanks produced, including the 200 built as part of the initial batch, included a PZB-200 night vision camera. That was later replaced by a WBG-X thermal imaging system, with it being likely that the Leopard 2A4 tanks Spain has donated are tanks that use this system. The tank has a 1,500 horsepower MTU diesel engine, with 5 fuel tanks spread across the vehicle, ensuring its operators can keep it running even if one of the tanks gets taken out. A nitrogen fire suppression system is in place, replacing the original halon systems to protect the tank from fires caused by explosions. And the 2A4 also has external smoke grenade launchers it can use to create a smoke screen when needed. Add a composite armor that makes heavy use of the previously mentioned tungsten, and you have a tank that packs a punch while also being able to take a hit. By now, you have identified a potential problem with this tank. It was made in the 1980s, or 1985 to be exact. That makes it a holdover from the dying days of the Cold War, leading some to speculate that the tank might not be able to match up to more modern tanks that Russia is fielding in Ukraine. That might have been the case were it not for the fact that Russia is barely using its modern tanks. According to Pravda, Russia has only deployed around 175 of its ultra-modern T-90M tanks to the front lines in Ukraine since February 2022. The majority of its tanks are older, with Putin relying on Soviet-era T-72s and T-62s to establish ground control, even going as far as to pull T-55s that were made just after World War II out of storage. He's also burning through these old tanks at an astonishing rate, with Ukraine's Ministry of Finance claiming that Ukraine has destroyed 8,636 Russian tanks as of September 8, 2024. So the Leopard 2A4s Spain is donating may not have been able to stand up against Russia's T-90Ms, but they won't have to. They'll be dealing with tanks that are even older. Better yet for Ukraine, Spain has committed to conducting full services and maintenance on the 19 2A4s it's sending, meaning they'll be in far better condition than many of the old Russian tanks that have been pulled out of storage and sent straight to the front lines with barely any maintenance being conducted on them. But perhaps more worrying for Putin than tanks will be the Patriot missiles Spain is sending to Ukraine. The Patriot air defense system has proven extremely helpful to Ukraine during its war with Russia. Though it only has 2 Patriot systems as of June 2024, with US President Joe Biden saying in July that America, together with Romania and Germany, is preparing to send a further 3 at some point in the future, it has made very good use of them. It's managed to use Patriot missiles to shoot down Russian Su-34 fighter jets from ranges of nearly 100 miles, showcasing the system's success against Russian aerial assets, as well as the ballistic missiles the Patriot was originally designed to counter. For context, the Su-34 is claimed by some to be Russia's top twin-seat fighter-bomber aircraft, meaning taking it out is important for Ukraine to prevent Russia from establishing aerial dominance over its territory. Back to the missiles. Spain is committed to sending 12 Patriot missiles to Ukraine, adding to the country's slowly growing stockpiles. Each of these missiles is about 17 feet long and is equipped with a track-via missile or TVM guidance system. That TVM is backed by a mobile engagement control center, which can transmit mid-course correction commands while the missile is in flight, allowing it to divert its course to ensure it hits its target. Behind this TVM sits a 198-pound high-explosive warhead, capable of destroying anything from Russian fighter jets to ballistic missiles. The missile has the range to back that firepower up too. It can travel for up to 43 miles, hitting an altitude of 14.9 miles, allowing it to hit an aerial target before it reaches its location, and even before it's descended to the point where it can do serious damage. It's fast too. A Patriot missile can reach speeds of up to 7,700 miles per hour, or Mach 10, meaning the missile can move at 10 times the speed of sound. That's why Ukraine has been able to use them to shoot Russian fighter jets out of the sky. The Su-34, for instance, has a top speed of Mach 1.8, meaning it's no match for the sheer speed of the Patriot. This is a missile that can shoot practically anything Putin can launch, right out of the sky. Still, there is some solace for Putin. Though it's clear that Spain has had enough of the Russian president's actions to the point where it's finally committing substantial military aid to Ukraine, that aid comes with a caveat. Unlike many of its NATO allies, including France, Germany, the UK, and even the US, Spain's weapons have a condition attached. Ukraine can't use them on Russian soil. Spanish President Pedro Sanchez made this clear on May 27th in the wake of making Spain's new military pact with Ukraine. When asked about Madrid's stance on allowing Ukraine to use NATO weapons inside Russia, Sanchez's response was, "We have neither such will or such intention, and I certainly have no information about this." In other words, Spain would not be joining its allies in permitting the use of weapons outside Ukraine. This stance may come as a surprise in the wake of Ukraine's invasion of the Russian oblast of Kursk in early August 2024. By now, it's clear that Zelensky has no intention of keeping the fight on Ukrainian soil. He's taking it to Putin's doorstep, and Ukraine is taking control of Russian territory as we speak. Right now, it holds about 465 square miles in Kursk, with 93 villages falling under Ukraine's control. Spain's decision to only permit Ukraine to use the weapons it provides defensively seems to run counter to Ukraine's new offensive strategy. Still, the stance shouldn't come as a surprise, given how slow Spain has been to act when compared to its European compatriots. The stance also shouldn't be taken as a sign that Spain is limiting its support of Ukraine either. This military funding is still a clear slap in Putin's face and a signal of intent from Spain. We see that in the officially released documentation of the Agreement on Security Cooperation Ukraine has signed with Spain, published on Zelensky's official website. The document goes into greater depth on the sheer breadth of the pact made between Spain and Ukraine, kicking off with a preamble in which Spain reaffirms its complete condemnation of Putin and his actions in Ukraine. Spain also committed to supporting Ukraine's right to defend itself per Article 51 of the UN Charter, as well as officially recognizing that Russia's invasion of Ukrainian sovereign territory is illegal. Spain also says that Ukraine should remain independent per the borders it had since 1991, while also broadening the cooperation and partnership between the two nations. Perhaps the key phrase in this agreement comes from its scope section. Spain is determined to provide support for Ukraine for as long as it takes, in coordination with its international partners and allies, in order to help Ukraine defend itself, as long as it takes. This pact isn't Spain giving a one-off donation to Ukraine. It's a full-blown commitment to offer continued support for as long as it takes for Ukraine to reassert its independence. That means the 5 billion euros Spain has pledged to provide up to 2027 may just be the start. If the war goes on for longer, Spain will make even more military donations. Yes, refusing to allow Ukraine to use Spanish weapons on Russian territory could be seen as Spain hedging its bets a little bit. That may be because Spain's decision isn't popular with everybody in Spain. On May 28, 2024, Euractiv reported that Sumar spokesman Ernest Urtasun has criticized Prime Minister Sanchez's decision to sign the agreement with Ukraine. For context, the Sumar party currently forms a coalition with Sanchez's PSOE party in Spain, with the party falling on the far left of the political spectrum. According to Urtasun, who also serves as Spain's culture minister, the green light for signing the agreement was given without Sanchez consulting the PSOE party. This lack of transparency is not serious when talking about an issue as important as defense, Urtasun sarcastically quipped, while also pointing out that Sanchez's recent decision to increase Spanish defense spending so it hits 2% of GDP was also made without Sumar input. Internal politics are clearly at play here, but that won't matter to Putin. Regardless of whether the Sumar party agrees with Sanchez's decision, Russia's leader has still been dealt a devastating blow. Diplomatically, Spain has made it clear that it wants Russia out of Ukraine so much that it's willing to support Putin's enemy for as long as it takes for that to happen. Spain has made a long-term commitment, with the first 10 of the promised Leopard 2A4 tanks having already arrived in Ukraine. The message is clear. Regardless of internal strife, Spain stands behind Ukraine more firmly than it has at any point during the Ukraine war. That's a slap in Putin's face, as it now means that every major European power has made it abundantly clear that they're uniting in wanting Putin out of Ukraine. What do you think about the support that Spain has pledged to Ukraine with this latest round of military aid, as well as its ongoing commitment to providing more in the future? Will it have a positive effect on Kyiv's ability to repel Russia's invading forces in the long term? 2024 was supposed to be the year of recovery, but for who? Putin's relentless push to swell the ranks has made the Russian army one of the largest in the world, with 1.3 million active soldiers and another 2 million in reserve. But this show of force came at a steep cost on the Russian home front, one that Russia is about to pay in blood. Meanwhile, Zelensky kept Ukraine's plans for the latter half of 2024 shrouded in secrecy, offering only cryptic hints of a strategy in motion. NATO, after months of waiting, finally began delivering F-16 fighter jets in July, following Congress's approval of a $60 billion aid package in April. The first half of the year was spent preparing for war, the second half unleashing it. And yet, despite Russia's overwhelming numbers and resources, Putin is teetering on the brink of a catastrophic defeat. Russia reinvigorated its efforts to invade and occupy Ukraine in May 2024. On paper, Russia had plenty of avenues to win the war. It had the manpower advantage as a result of relentless conscription campaigns and the fact that Ukraine had a little less than half of Russia's population to begin with. It had the material advantage, being perhaps the only country that produced the ammunition that the Soviet-era tanks and artillery batteries used, and which were the main military equipment on both sides of the war. The US Congress had previously spent months bickering about sending more aid to Ukraine, believing that funding the war would be a pointless effort. Yet throughout all that, the so-called summer invasion was a resounding failure for Russia, perhaps due to the bizarre choices made by the Russian military command. You see, apart from the initial blitzkrieg attempt at reaching Kyiv from the north, which was repelled within a few months of the invasion starting, Russia has focused most of its efforts on occupying the eastern and southern points of Ukraine. The former was a relatively obvious target, with Russia already annexing Crimea 10 years ago and having a much greater geopolitical presence in the surrounding Ukrainian regions to begin with. The latter was done to prevent Ukraine from being able to export goods, as Ukraine is a significant grain exporter across the Black Sea. Therefore, most of 2023 was spent with Russia putting more pressure on the eastern side of the Russo-Ukrainian front, occupying the Donetsk region. The Russian army's next goal in the area for 2024 was naturally going to be the largest city in the region, that being Pokrovsk. The 60,000 population city is the transportation hub between the Eastern Front and the rest of Ukraine, so Russia was trying to capture the city as part of the 2024 summer campaign made sense in a way. However, what happened was nothing short of a moment of impulsiveness. Instead of going for the Eastern Front, the main Russian force during the May and June campaigns was focused on the northern city of Kharkiv. That's the same city and the same region that was under siege in the first few months of the invasion all the way back in 2022, and which the Ukrainians retook by September of that year. Additionally, rather than pressing into the Kharkiv region with armored vehicles and tanks supported by long-range artillery strikes, Russia heavily favored infantry-based tactics. From the reports in the area, Russia used cobbled-together turtle tanks, which were unwieldy armored vehicles, with the goal of absorbing as much Ukrainian fire as possible and giving more breathing room to the infantry forces. For infantry, Russians turned to equipping troops with motorcycles to give them more maneuverability and speed compared to traditional armored vehicles. Apparently, the goal of the summer campaign was to cover as much ground as possible, as fast as possible, using as little of Russia's heavy armor as necessary. This could stem from the widespread shortage of tanks that Russia could allocate to the campaign in the first place. In 2023, it became apparent that Russia was running out of modern armor. Russia's most modern battle tank was the T-90, effectively an upgraded version of the old T-72 that was manufactured throughout the Soviet era. However, Ukraine has been able to deal with the T-90s via the gifted tanks from the West and by exploiting the tank's critical weak spot under the chassis, the autoloader. Unlike the Western tanks, the T-90, as well as the T-72, uses an auto-loading mechanism that also stores excess sensitive ammunition, which is located under the turret. If an explosion, such as the one delivered by mine or drone, the latter of which Ukraine has become bona fide experts in, hits the turret, there's a chance that all the stored ammunition detonates and obliterates the tank. By removing Russia's more modern tanks from the equation, both Russia and Ukraine have mainly relied on the contingent of older Soviet-era tanks like the T-72s, T-62s, and even older T-55s. The Western sanctions on Russia have prevented it from getting more modern pieces of equipment, which resulted in Russia being forced to salvage or re-equip Soviet tanks to use in the war. Even with that, a bulk of the tanks were being sent to the Eastern Front. That led to the strange situation where Russia has mainly used infantry tactics to make headway into the Kharkiv region. For the first few weeks of the summer offensive, Russia did see some progress, managing to eke some 10 miles into Ukrainian territory, but nowhere near close to the city of Kharkiv itself. The losses that Russia accumulated over the summer offensive were staggering. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the invading force contained between 30,000 and 70,000 soldiers, leading to a significant increase in daily losses incurred by Russia. Ukrainska Pravda, a news outlet that tracks daily losses, suggests that Russia has been losing over 1,200 soldiers per day across all fronts throughout the summer offensive. Over the course of May and June, the months with the most activity on the newly opened Kharkiv front, Russia suffered around 70,000 casualties. That's a significant blow to the already failing Russian morale and attempts to improve the troop count, with many comparing the Russian tactics to feeding soldiers into a meat grinder for no apparent reason. So what was the ultimate goal behind the summer offensive? Some strategists suggest that Russia was confident that the lower estimate of 30,000 troops would be enough to dig deep into Ukrainian territory and capture Kharkiv. After all, Ukraine itself has focused its efforts on fortifying the Eastern Front, so it wasn't out of the realms of possibility to consider that Kharkiv would be sparsely defended as a result. Other tacticians believe that the Kharkiv offensive was meant as a diversion. Its goal was to make Ukraine think that Russia was putting most of its efforts into occupying Kharkiv, forcing the Ukrainian army to change gears and fall back from the Eastern Front to defend the north. Either way, Russia was planning to use Kharkiv as a means to an end, with that end being making more progress on the Eastern Front. However, all the Russians ended up doing was falling into a massive trap. The Kharkiv invasion, ill-equipped and poorly planned as it was, turned out to be a massive failure. Despite early gains, Russia couldn't maintain the momentum, and Ukraine managed to reinforce the area with minimal setbacks on the Eastern Front. The Russian army was forced to retreat relatively quickly, allowing Ukraine to retake the occupied villages near the border and proclaim victory in that battle. Granted, Russia managed to gain some territory in the east, roughly 400 square miles, but it came at the cost of 70,000 soldiers, significant losses in tanks and other armored vehicles, and the main target of Pokrovsk was still relatively safe. And remember, by the time Russia started the summer invasion, Ukraine still had yet to receive the financial and military aid that the US Congress announced in April. When the summer offensive was over, that money and equipment started to trickle into the country. Now it was up to Ukraine to make the move. And so we come to the beginning of August 2024, when Ukraine made one of the most surprising yet effective advances in the past 18 months of warfare, the invasion of Kursk. On paper, the Kursk region should have the same amount of defenses on the Russian side as Kharkiv did on the Ukrainian side. Both regions are on the border between the two countries and therefore have a high potential of being used as part of the northern front in the war. However, Ukraine went in with a much smaller contingent, some reports suggesting around 1,000 troops only, and completely swept through Russia's defenses in the area. More troops followed soon, creating an organized yet mobile invading force that could occupy one village after another without setting down permanent defenses. Ultimately, Ukraine's success came down to a few factors. One, Ukraine has managed to provide a much more effective cover and pressure via artillery fire in Kursk. The strikes focused on key military fortifications and infrastructure that could be used to reinforce the area with more troops. Satellite images of the region showed a few bridges and vital roads being destroyed throughout the region, effectively cutting the Russian army off from the mainland. Second, Russia has vastly overestimated the effectiveness of its ground forces in the area. As a result, most of the troops stationed throughout the Kursk region ended up being fresh recruits who have only had several weeks of combat training and were not exactly meant to fight on the front lines. What ended up happening with the new troops was a wave of Russians surrendering as the Ukrainian army advanced from one village to the next. Within the first week of the invasion, a Ukrainian prison that was housing prisoners of war reported processing 300 captured Russian soldiers, more than 80% of whom were newer conscripts. According to some estimates, the actual count of the prisoners could inflate by several hundred in mere weeks. Russia has also heavily underplayed the importance and the extent of the Kursk region. The initial reports made by the Russian Ministry of Defense suggested that the invading army had only 300 soldiers. The subsequent report even went so far as to proclaim that the Ukrainian troops were being actively pushed back by the local troops. This was a bold-faced lie to cover up the utter failure of the Russian war machine to account for the mere possibility that Ukraine was suddenly gaining ground. Soon after, more accurate reports by the Ukrainian and Western intelligence came in with surveys of the actual damage dealt in the Kursk region. They suggested that the invasion has caused between 120,000 and 200,000 residents of the area to become displaced, with Ukraine managed to occupy dozens of villages and slowly advance toward the administrative center of Kursk. 3 weeks after the incursion, the Russian response is still uncertain. For the most part, Russia continues to downplay the effect of the Kursk incursion on the actual progress of the war. The country's artillery has managed to slow down the Ukrainian forces and has thus far prevented them from going deeper into enemy territory. On the other hand, Russia has also scrambled to create trenches roughly 25 miles into the occupied territory. These trenches don't seem like they're going to be used as defensive positions by the Russians, though. Based on Russian actions so far and the state of the military in the region, it's likely that Ukraine can take control of these trenches and use them as stopgaps in a prolonged counter-invasion of Russia. On the other hand, Russia has reinvigorated its efforts on the Eastern Front. Reports from the last 2 weeks of August 2024 suggested that Russian forces have come as close as 7 miles to the city of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian government has urged the residents of the city to evacuate, but has encountered significant issues with moving large numbers of civilians so close to the renewed front lines. The reason for that is Russia's complete lack of care for Ukrainian civilians. Even before the newest waves of fighting, the Russian army has displayed utter ruthlessness when it comes to dealing with civilians. Throughout the war, Russia has frequently targeted primarily civilian areas with missiles and drones, forcing the Ukrainian military to heavily invest and ask for anti-air defensive systems, such as the US-made Patriots. The Russian airstrikes were focusing on Ukrainian hospitals, which housed both civilian and military casualties, an act which is against the Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law. In contrast, the Ukrainian army has made efforts to minimize civilian casualties in Kursk, working alongside international humanitarian organizations to provide aid to the people who remained in the area. The reinforcements and infrastructure that were struck by the Ukrainian airstrikes primarily had a military use, preventing Russia from reinforcing the region. Furthermore, Ukraine has shown no long-term goals to control the area it occupied during the Kursk incursion, at least according to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. This is unlike Russia's persistent efforts to annex parts of Ukraine, trying to claim the Donetsk region. President Zelensky has suggested that he's ready to present a plan to the US that outlines the terms of a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. The invasion of Kursk is therefore meant to drive down the narrative that Ukraine is not yet ready to yield to Russia and will continue to go on the offensive. By doing so, Ukraine can get a significant edge over Russia. First, the extent of the invasion in Kursk showcases how much Ukraine can accomplish in a relatively short time with restricted access to Western resources. While Russia has managed to occupy roughly 400 square miles of Ukrainian land between January and July 2024, Ukraine currently holds some 500 square miles of the Kursk Oblast territory, all acquired within the span of 3 weeks. This gives Zelensky the confidence to ask for more resources, particularly long-range missiles, fighter jets and artillery, which would allow Ukraine to press deeper into Russia by advancing on the newly made Kursk front. This will allow Ukraine to force Russia to back away from the Eastern Front and rethink whether Kursk is an unimportant part of the wider war. Additionally, the recent allotment of aid primarily comes in the form of ammunition and anti-air missiles, which have seen consistently positive results on the Eastern Front throughout the Kursk invasion. One of the most recent Russian attacks on the Eastern Front has been a devastating airstrike with 127 missiles and 109 drones launched, according to an Al Jazeera report. Ukraine's air defenses have managed to take out 102 missiles and 99 drones, heavily reducing the damage Russia could inflict on Ukrainian military compounds, infrastructure, and even civilian areas. Russia has been getting bolder in what it terms acceptable military targets, with one drone hitting a dam only miles upstream from Kyiv. The dam suffered minimal damage and remained intact, but it showcased that Russia will not relent until it completely dominates Ukraine. To that end, the current incursion of Kursk provides a twofold solution to this problem. First, Ukraine has started to ramp up its drone attacks as well, considering that the country has heavily invested in creating a domestic military drone industry and has received long-range missiles from NATO. The current effective range of the Ukrainian drones is estimated to be roughly 1,100 miles away from the Ukrainian border. By pushing further into Russian territory, Ukraine can create a favorable position to start launching more precision strikes directly at Moscow. Until now, Moscow has been relatively untouched by the conflict. The conscription efforts were disproportionately targeting rural areas, especially people who belong to Russia's many national minorities. A PBS News interview in 2023 suggested that 6 out of 10 regions with the highest death tolls were in Siberia and the Far East, and that men from certain minorities were as much as 75 times more likely to die from the war than Muscovites. In contrast, Moscow has seen a significant brain drain in the first months of the war, with around 900,000 Russians leaving the country by the end of 2022. Many of them were blue-collar, highly skilled workers, which has largely stripped the capital of people who view the war negatively. If Ukraine manages to put direct military pressure on Moscow and give the capital a feeling of what it's like to be in an active war, it's highly likely that the public sentiment on the war will change. Even in an authoritarian regime such as Putin's, this could lead to a significant ideological shift within the country that could spell doom for the nation's leadership and geopolitical relations. But let's go back to the second reason why Ukraine's Kursk invasion can solve its air defense problems. The army's ability to withstand hostile airstrikes while advancing in enemy territory gives Zelensky more sway to ask for direct military equipment from NATO countries, primarily in the form of Patriots and other anti-air defense systems. These can prove vital if Ukraine wants to maintain its momentum and pressure Russia without receiving air retaliation. And Ukraine has one more ace up its sleeve for aerial supremacy. The F-16s have arrived. After months of training, NATO's shipment of 65 F-16s has been deemed ready to take flight over Ukraine, piloted by Ukrainian fighter pilots. The F-16 is one of the most modern fighter jets available to both sides of the conflict. Russia has the Su-27s, which were specifically made to counter the threat of the F-16 but failed to do so. The addition of F-16s aims to degrade what little is left of Russia's hope to control Ukraine via its airspace. This is why Zelensky has also been adamant about asking for even more fighter jets to defend the country. The small victory that the Ukrainian army achieved in Kursk can be seen as a precursor and a catalyst of what can be done in the wider context of the war itself. But why is airspace control vital in turning the tide of war? The answer lies in Russia's saber-rattling. During 2022 and 23, NATO efforts to end the war by providing Ukraine with more advanced military equipment have been met with resistance from Russia. Putin has frequently alluded to the possibility that there's a line that NATO cannot cross, or it risks impeding on Russia's sovereignty, which is quite rich considering the goal of the special military operation. Russia has frequently used its reserve of nuclear weapons to prevent NATO from providing full support to Ukraine under the pretense that Ukraine would use the weapons to invade Russia in turn. While that moment has happened, Ukraine has managed to occupy a portion of Russia. The Russian response was to first deny the claims, then fabricate increasingly bold lies about the state of the invasion, followed by a half-hearted attempt at securing the Kursk region while also pressuring Ukraine on the existing Eastern Front. Therefore, it became even more unlikely that Russia will use nuclear weaponry against Ukraine and NATO. NATO's strategy so far has been to arm Ukraine just enough so it can prolong the war, but avoid crossing Russia's lines in the sand, so to speak. The Kursk incursion and lack of Russia's nuclear responses might just give NATO the go-ahead to approve more ambitious plans to provide more comprehensive aid to Ukraine. This means that Putin is losing all his leverage against the West, and that NATO can start putting more pressure to end the war in Ukraine's favor. But there's yet another factor to consider when discussing the current war events: economies. Both Russia and Ukraine have had to heavily change how their economies function in wartime. Ukraine is using nearly $350 billion worth of financial and military equipment aid from Europe and the US to keep itself running. More specifically, the country had previously suffered greatly from Russia being able to control the Black Sea with its navy, a military force that Ukraine is sorely lacking in. However, Ukraine managed to score yet another significant victory on that front, mainly via drone warfare. Starting with the spring of 2022, Ukraine has made several attempts to create drones that were specifically made for sea-to-sea warfare. The sea-deployed Magura V5 drone was designed to deliver an explosive payload by swimming rather than flying. The first public showcases of the Magura V5s were made later in the year, damaged Russia's newest Black Sea Fleet flagship and a minesweeper. Emboldened by the success, Ukrainians began to use the drones more offensively and supported their sea-based attacks with traditional air-to-surface strikes deeper into Russia's territory to cut off access to the Black Sea. The result was 26 sunk or damaged ships in the Russian fleet, forcing Russia to withdraw from Sevastopol in October 2023. This allowed Ukraine to reopen some of its previous maritime trading routes and start exporting across the Black Sea. By August 2024, Ukrainska Pravda reported that the reopened Black Sea corridor had been used by 2,300 ships over the past year, and that grain exports were slowly starting to reach pre-war numbers. This effectively means the country doesn't solely need to rely on financial aid to get its economy up and running. In contrast, Russia's economy has become more isolationist than ever. In response to the invasion, the EU has stopped Russia's oil and gas exports. In response, Russia has been forced to find new clients, namely China and India. But the deal with China comes with significant caveats. The price of natural gas was purported to be roughly half of what Russia was achieving on the Western market, limiting its options to create income from selling natural resources. The US has also posed significant economic sanctions on Russia, preventing the country from trading in US dollars or obtaining any technology or equipment that could be construed as being used militarily. The short-term effect of the sweeping trade changes was that China and Russia achieved record trade volume in 2023 at over $240 billion. However, even that doesn't seem like it'll work out in Russia's favor in the long run. While the total trade has managed to grow slightly, the oil trade has actually seen a decline in 2024 so far compared to 2023, and the prices are unstable. Furthermore, Russia's economy has evidently gone all in on supplying the war effort. The 2024 budget has allocated around 39% of the government funding to military and national defense, a staggering figure compared to the rest of the world. Russia has now one of the highest military spending figures, both in total and as a percentage of GDP, 6% compared to the US's 3.4%, China's 1.7%, and NATO's 2.7% average. This can be attributed to the country's blossoming energy sector, which is again a response to Russia's heavy reliance on exporting oil and natural gas. The energy sector has the potential to create an even greater imbalance in employment opportunities for Russian citizens. If the energy sector is more lucrative than, let's say, manufacturing or agriculture, Russia will see a significant shift in energy companies gaining employees at the expense of other industries. The newly minted middle and upper classes will create a demand for the service sector, which will again drain the less desirable industrial sectors. But the process can only continue as long as the energy sector continues to grow, and that growth isn't sustainable. Furthermore, the downfall of the other sectors will force Russia to depend on importing more and more from neighboring countries, typically China or the former Soviet nations like Kazakhstan and Belarus. Ultimately, this gives China far greater control of Russia's geopolitics than Putin might feel comfortable with. If China decides to pull the plug on Russian exports as a result of US pressure, Russia's economy might be facing a downturn, which will halt the country's militaristic ambitions. When the invasion started, and over the course of the following 2 years, Russia was hoping to use its resource advantage to drain Ukraine's resources and win by plowing over what was left of the country when the latter's military was annihilated. However, the recent events in Kursk have shown that Ukrainians have plenty of fight left in them, and that the world no longer has much to fear from Russia's nuclear arsenal. With Russia's military proving to be at an increasing disadvantage compared to Ukrainian troops bolstered by NATO, Russia's economy propped up by China and already past the point of no return, and Putin unable to manipulate NATO into standing down, Russia has pretty much run out of options. We might see that the closing months of 2024 and the beginning of 2025 become the effective end of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If that happens, Putin is unlikely to have much ground to make demands for peace will be enforced on Russia, and it might spell doom for Russia as a country itself. But what do you think? Does the Kursk invasion of Russia mean that Ukraine is on a quick path to victory, or will the war continue for a few more years? Russia's forces should have been overwhelming. By December 2021, it had amassed around 100,000 troops around Ukraine, surrounding the country on 3 sides. When Russia finally entered Ukraine in February 2022, it had assembled 83 battalion tactical groups, with the initial incursion seeing up to 200,000 soldiers invade in what was supposed to be a smash-and-grab exercise. Their goal was simple: secure Kyiv in a matter of weeks so Russian President Vladimir Putin could depose Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and claim Ukraine as part of Russia. Only, that's not what happened. Facing seemingly insurmountable odds, the valiant Ukrainian troops pushed Russia's initial advance back. And since February 2022, those soldiers have fought valiantly, slowing Russia's progress to a crawl, retaking key cities like Kharkiv, and as of August 6, 2024, entering Russian territory to conduct an invasion of their own. Russia has been outsmarted at every turn, outmaneuvered regularly by a Ukrainian military at dwarfs both in terms of sheer manpower and the amount of equipment that it has at its disposal. And now Ukraine is no longer holding the line while trying to defend itself, it's overseeing the crumbling of the Russian military that will ultimately see Putin and his army collapse under the very type of pressure he tried to exert on Ukraine. That's the opinion of retired US General David Petraeus. But why does Petraeus believe that Russia's military is on the verge of crumbling? This video will answer that question using interview quotes from the general himself, along with evidence to support the claims he makes. But before answering that question, we need to answer another. Who is David Petraeus? Born in November 1952, Petraeus is a US Army general who was appointed to lead the multinational forces former President George W. Bush amassed to serve in Iraq in 2007. Petraeus is also the former Commander-in-Chief of Central Command, or CENTCOM, a role in which he served between 2008 and 2010. As well as a former director of the CIA and one of the commanders who led the US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. He has received a slew of honors for his service, including the Distinguished Service Medal, 4 Legion of Merit Awards, a pair of Defense Superior Service Medals, and a Bronze Star with a V device, which is given to those who display great valor. In other words, he's a military expert who has seen and done it all. So when he talks about the state of Putin's military, it's wise to listen to what he has to say. That brings us to August 18, 2024. On that date, interview footage emerged of Petraeus speaking about the strategic brilliance Ukraine has displayed during its war with Russia, and how that brilliance has allowed Ukraine to reshape the entire war. It's taken the war out of Putin's control, grasping the momentum and putting Putin in a position where he has to watch the slow collapse of a military that many believed to be one of the world's strongest before February 2022. Petraeus starts with a brief analysis of Ukraine's invasion of Kursk. They did achieve enormous surprise with the Russians. They managed to assemble elements of 4 brigades, not just infantry and armor, but also artillery, air defenses, electronic warfare, and so forth. So it's a real combined arms effort with logistics. Petraeus refers, of course, to Ukraine's initial invasion of Kursk. Russia attempted to downplay that invasion, which began on August 6, 2024, claiming that it had ended what it dubbed a small incursion. It hadn't. The initial group of 300 Ukrainians that's believed to have crossed the border on that date has since been supplemented with several thousand more, with Ukraine also claiming to control 482 square miles of Kursk. That includes over 90 settlements, according to Zelensky, with the success coming as a result of the combined arms effort that Petraeus highlights. The retired general also highlights one of the key mistakes Putin made that enabled the Kursk invasion in the first place, pointing out that the Russian defenses on the border were not very substantial. Again, that's been backed up by later reports, which were mostly made up of recent conscripts, many of whom were aged between 18 and 20. An August 30th report in the Moscow Times notes that the deaths and surrenders of these conscripts highlighted a hollow civic identity within Russia, while adding that the loss of those conscripts will resonate within Russian society. That's bad enough for Putin. However, the Moscow Times also notes that the use of conscripts in such a vital area shows that the Russian army has degraded to the point where it cannot fight a fully fledged war with professional soldiers. In other words, Russia has been exposed. When Petraeus says that the border defenses were not very substantial, he's actually hinting at the fact that Russia's military has already collapsed to such a point that it's relying on inexperienced and poorly trained conscripts to defend its own territory. Back to Petraeus, he also reveals what Ukraine has already gained from the Kursk invasion. They're pushing the Russians out. From this, they're gaining an enormous morale boost. They're collecting Russian prisoners for later exchange for Ukrainian prisoners held by Russia. They have also cut a very important rail line that Russia used to send logistics and troops from, say, the Moscow region down to the southeastern part of Ukraine. There's a fair amount to unpack here. On the subject of morale, it's clear that the Kursk invasion has had a positive effect. Speaking to Reuters on August 21st, 51-year-old Kyiv resident Ola Pavlovska said, "This was a very brave and important step for keeping up morale in society." Her words are echoed by many in Kyiv, as well as soldiers who were involved in the invasion. The Kursk invasion isn't a simple act of Ukraine taking Russian territory. It's a demonstration, one that shows Ukraine is now fighting the war on its own terms, rather than Russia's. And again, the fact that the invasion was successful showcases the weaknesses of Russia in key areas. It may be pouring hundreds of thousands of soldiers into Ukraine, but it's doing so while its internal defenses crumble. As for prisoners, Ukraine now has plenty of those. On August 27th, Kyiv's chief commander, Alexander Syrsky, claimed that Ukraine had captured a staggering 594 prisoners of war, or POWs, in just 21 days, meaning prisoners are being taken at a rate of around 28 per day. "We managed to increase our exchange fund," Syrsky said, which reinforces Petraeus' comments that Ukraine now has more leverage to get back some of its lost troops as a result of Kursk. Even in these early comments from Petraeus, we see evidence that Russia's military is crumbling. It barely put up a defense against Ukraine's incursion, with those defending being recent conscripts rather than experienced Russian soldiers. And it's losing men to surrender at an alarming rate. Add to this actions like the crippling of the rail line Petraeus mentions, and you see how Ukraine is also attempting to cut the Russians that are in its country off from their own country. The loss of that line means fewer troops and less equipment entering Ukraine from the north, setting the stage for further Russian crumbling later on. The situation is so bad, claims Petraeus, that Russia has been forced to scramble. They're having to pull forces from the southern area to react to this. It's obvious that their border forces, the irregular territorial forces, and the National Guard have been incapable of standing up to the Ukrainians. Again, the evidence backs him up. In the same Politico piece in which Syrsky claimed Ukraine had taken almost 600 prisoners, Ukraine's leading general also highlighted how many soldiers Russia has been forced to send to Kursk. He says that the Kremlin has sent some 30,000 soldiers from other directions to Kursk, and their number is growing. That may seem like a logical response from Moscow, and it is, but it's also a response that shows weakness in the Russian military. If Putin's forces were as strong as he would like the rest of the world to believe, he wouldn't need to divert soldiers from key locations in Ukraine to defend Kursk. He'd simply send some from Moscow or elsewhere in Russian territory. But he's having to weaken his attack in Ukraine so he can defend Russian territory, which reinforces Petraeus' point that Russia's internal defenses simply aren't strong enough. We may not be seeing the collapse of the Russian military in terms of the sheer number of soldiers, but the fact that 30,000 troops have been moved from Ukraine suggests that there's a major skill problem in Russia's military. Putin doesn't feel he can rely on the soldiers he has in Russia to do the job, which once again means Ukraine has succeeded in exposing Russia's frailty. Petraeus then switches focus to consider the broader implications of the Kursk invasion on the Ukraine war, particularly when it comes to Russia's attempts to taking more territory in the Donetsk region. "I think they're trying to continue their offensive in the southeastern area, and Donetsk in particular, and not interfere with that. And that does, to be fair, continue to achieve incremental gains against the Ukrainian forces," he says. He's not wrong. Though Putin has been forced to divert troops away from some of Russia's offensives, it's still slowly gaining ground in Donetsk and other regions. The Institute for the Study of War highlighted this in late August, with its interactive maps showing that Russia has made some significant advances in Pokrovsk. which is a city in Donetsk that serves as a key logistical hub for Ukraine. As of August 28th, Russia has entered Memrik, which lies 18 miles from Pokrovsk, and it's slowly continuing to advance. Does that mean Ukraine's effort to divert Russian troops has failed? Not necessarily. Petraeus notes that this continued focus on Donetsk belies Putin's inability to create a proper response to the situation in Kursk. So far, not a particularly coherent response yet, the retired general says when talking about Putin's response. What the organizational architecture of this will eventually be is not yet clear to the observers out there. Eventually, they have to really push their forces against this to get the Ukrainians out of Russian territory. Putin knows this. His problem is that he can't come up with a clear plan that details the logistics of how Russia will achieve this and where the combat power will come from. The redeployment of 30,000 soldiers to Kursk may make it seem like Russia is mounting a powerful response, but that high number is deceiving. Putin has given Ukraine plenty of time to mount defenses, as well as cut off access to the regions it's already taken. It's already destroyed 2 bridges into Kursk, allowing it to create a buffer zone within Russian territory through which those 30,000 soldiers will need to navigate. And without the bridges that they would rely upon to get into Kursk, those soldiers are going to be far less effective than their numbers indicate. It again shows how relatively inadequate these Russian forces inside Russia actually are, Petraeus claims. Russia is sending all of its mainline forces into the offensive in the southeast and holding the line in the south. Again, these comments point to a collapse of the Russian military on its soil. Diverting 30,000 troops sounds impressive until you realize that this diversion will be less effective because of the time it's taken for Putin to create that response. It smacks of a leader dealing in desperation. He has been forced to recognize that Russia's internal forces can't stand up to a relatively small contingent of invading Ukrainians. Now he's stuck between a rock and a hard place, and he's mostly choosing to continue the Russian offensive in southeastern Ukraine. That decision may come back to bite him, as it opens the door for Ukraine to continue making gains in Kursk, all while fighting off the inexperienced and scattered troops that Putin is sending to retake the territory. That indecision could also mean that Russia is no longer in a position to end the Ukraine war on its own terms. It also shows that Ukraine is capable of doing something that the increasingly weakening Russian forces can't do: conduct complicated advances. Throughout the war, we've seen the same pattern in Putin's strategy. Rather than relying on the combined might of his aerial and ground forces to conduct cooperative strikes against Ukrainian positions, he has simply bombarded these positions with artillery while sending soldier after soldier into them. Putin has created a meat grinder. We saw this during the Battle of Bakhmut, which lasted a year and at one point saw Russia losing around 820 soldiers per day. Its loss tally by the end of the battle was around 30,000, a heavy price to pay for taking a fairly small city of just 16.1 square miles. With the Kursk invasion, Ukraine has taken well over 20 times that amount of territory in less than a month, with barely any losses being recorded on its side. Part of the reason for that comes down to what Petraeus mentioned regarding Russia using recently assigned conscripts to guard its borders. However, Global Guardian intelligence analyst Joe Chaffetz says that there's another reason. If nothing else, Kyiv's foray into Kursk has demonstrated that Ukrainian forces are capable of complicated mechanized advances, he told USA Today. Continuing to use that strategy could allow Ukraine to replicate the Kursk success inside Russia, enabling it to take more territory. And in doing so, Ukraine could even thwart Putin's strategy of making incremental and irreversible advances. The meat grinder approach would have to end, and Putin would be forced to focus on more complex tactics. Given that Russia has already lost around 613,500 soldiers as of producing this video, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, and is set to lose many more, that need to match Ukraine's complex tactics creates a problem. Russia's military may not have the expertise needed, especially after losing so many combat veterans. So its collapse may come partially as a result of ineptitude and inexperience, rather than simply no longer having the manpower. Petraeus' comments ended with his pointing out how inadequate Russia's forces are. That alone could be taken as a sign of impending collapse of the Russian military. However, there are other issues at play. Take the psychological impact this invasion could have on Russia and its military as an example. Before the war in Ukraine began, Russia was feared the world over as having one of the world's strongest militaries. This was an image that Putin was more than happy to play up, not least because it fed into the image of the strongman, authoritarian leader that's enabled him to hold on to power in Russia for over 20 years. However, even before the Kursk invasion, Russia's efforts in Ukraine had revealed it to be something of a paper tiger. Yes, it can withstand a lot of punishment, but each of its attacks leads to severe losses, with those lost soldiers being replaced by contracted mercenaries or poorly trained conscripts. Now, those paper tiger accusations have intensified given how easily Ukraine entered Kursk. Beyond having a strong impact on Ukrainian morale, that incursion has to be damaging to Russia's military and, in particular, how Putin's people view his ability to defend his countrymen. The early signs of a decline in confidence are already coming in the wake of the Kursk invasion. Speaking to CBC in Canada, a Ukrainian soldier who wished only to be identified by his codename of Wolverine spoke about his experiences with Russians in Kursk following his taking part in the invasion. In addition to pointing out how good the capture of Russian territory was for Ukrainian morale, Wolverine noted that many of the Russian soldiers and people he came across seemed disillusioned. They speak about betrayal from the Russian government, Wolverine told CBC. They did not declare evacuation and immediately turned off water and light, so they created unbearable living conditions. In other words, Putin started treating Kursk like a war zone without really thinking about its people. Granted, the evacuation orders eventually came, with around 200,000 of the oblast's residents now having been moved on, but those early days of the Kursk invasion revealed a lot to the people living in the region. They showed that Putin had underestimated his Ukrainian foe, and that he didn't have a plan in place to help his people if they were ever in danger. Earlier, we spoke about Putin's strongman image and how it's essential to the leadership of his people and military. That image relies on Putin being able to demonstrate that he can lead Russia to greater things and that, crucially, he can protect Russia from any external threat. The Kursk invasion shook that belief, to the point where many Russians will now be doubting Putin's leadership. What does that have to do with Petraeus' comments about the Russian military crumbling? Lowering opinions of Putin damaged a collective Russian morale that was already a problem before the Kursk invasion. In March 2014, the Forum for Ukrainian Studies published a piece in which it noted that one of Putin's main military strategies appears to be to lower Ukrainian morale via the maximization of Russia's material and manpower advantages. The idea is to use constant pressure to bear down on Ukraine. Only now the situation has been flipped. Ukraine's soldiers are in Russia. Their morale is higher than it's been for a long time. Meanwhile, Russian soldiers have been struggling with morale crises since the Ukraine war turned into a conflict of attrition. Putin has been recruiting people who never wanted to be in the war in the first place. Desertions and post-abandonments are rife, with over 18,000 Russian troops abandoning the country's southern military district in April 2024 alone. Pressure is now being placed on Putin and his military. Morale is key in war. It affects a soldier's ability to engage in combat operations, in addition to affecting commanders and their ability to organize their troops. How can you coordinate an attack or a defense when you're having to deal with soldiers deserting daily? By failing to stop the Kursk invasion and then being slow to respond to it, Putin has placed even greater strain on a collective Russian military morale that was already close to the breaking point. So Russia's military crumbling may end up being less a direct result of it being further stretched by the Ukrainian advance, and more a result of its soldiers simply losing their appetite for a fight that was never meant to last this long in the first place. Psychologically, Russia's military can no longer view itself as one of the world's strongest. It's failed to take Ukraine after 2.5 years of trying. Any advances it makes in Ukraine are slow and come at the cost of thousands of lives. And now Russian civilians are having to deal with the war being brought to their doorstep. Add all of this to the points Petraeus made about Ukraine using its troops in Russia to cut off vital supply lines and the region itself, and you have a collection of issues that ruin the Russian psyche. Putin can no longer position himself as the strongman defender of Russia. And with the loss of that positioning may come the loss of support of the Russian military, along with the country's people and any of Russia's elite who may come sniffing around Putin's seat of power. Let's come back to Petraeus' comments about Russian military inadequacy. The general made those comments in the context of Russia's internal defenses, pointing out that the use of inexperienced conscripts as border guards and defensive lines within Russia played a large part in Ukraine's Kursk successes. Those inexperienced soldiers couldn't stand up to the far more combat-hardened Ukrainians they came up against, leading to the massive volume of surrenders we're seeing during this incursion. That inadequacy is the result of a larger problem in Russia's military that's causing it to crumble from the inside: terrible training. In May 2023, Newsweek reported on a British intelligence assessment which said that Russia's ground forces in Ukraine mostly consisted of poorly trained, mobilized reservists who were becoming increasingly reliant on antiquated equipment. The situation was so bad, according to the report, that Russia's combined grouping of forces, which numbered 200,000 at the time, was only capable of completing very simple infantry-based operations. We've seen that throughout the war. Every Russian gain has come as a result of Putin throwing people at a Ukrainian position, sacrificing thousands in the process, while he fails to bring Russia's superior aerial might to bear. Joint operations are limited and usually reduced to launching bombs and artillery at a position, followed up by soldiers, which is an antiquated tactic. CNA points out that these training problems have long existed in Russia's military. It says these issues exist for many reasons, ranging from procedural rigidity and, as the British pointed out, a lack of access to proper equipment. However, it also notes a lack of standardization, a result, it says, of an emphasis on in-house training within units. In other words, much of a Russian soldier's training takes place once they have already been deployed. That's fine in a peaceful scenario, as the new soldier has time to learn the ropes, but when Russia is in an active war, this focus on in-unit training inevitably leads to barely trained conscripts being put into positions they're nowhere near ready enough to handle. That's what happened in Kursk. But it's happening in Ukraine as well, with this poor training playing a huge role in Russia experiencing as many losses as it has. Think about what this means for Russia's military in the future. Putin has already lost over 600,000 soldiers if Ukraine's Ministry of Finance has accurate figures, which likely means he's already lost most of the experienced troops he initially sent into Ukraine. Those experienced soldiers are being followed up by poorly trained infantry who don't have the time to learn the ropes in the traditional Russian way, resulting in even more losses. Internally, Russia is defending itself with conscripts as young as 19 years old who have no chance of contending with a Ukraine that's capable of far more complex combat operations. Perhaps that inexperience is part of the reason why the coherent Russian response to the Kursk incursion Petraeus mentions hasn't come yet. Putin can't trust his poorly trained soldiers to put up an adequate defense. Before the Kursk invasion, Putin was getting away with this poor training. Russia faced no threat on its soil, so Putin could conscript, contract, and cajole people into being fed into the Ukraine war meat grinder because his tactic was to destroy morale with a constant flood of manpower. Now the situation is different. Russia is having to defend itself while it attacks, and as Petraeus points out, we're already seeing the signs of a Russian collapse. Mass surrenders in the face of Ukrainian invaders, the pushing of troops from other locations into Russia to mount a response weakened the Russian front line elsewhere. Combine this stretching of manpower with prominent training issues and quickly declining Russian morale, and you have all of the ingredients of an incoming military collapse. That collapse may come as a result of Ukraine's pressure in Kursk. It may even come because Putin's people no longer trust him to be the strong man they need to defend them. But make no mistake about it, the collapse is coming. At least that's according to General Petraeus. But what do you think about the state of Russia's military today, and what the future may hold for Putin's forces? Is talk about a collapse a touch ambitious, or is Russia heading toward a fall? As the war in Ukraine drags on, now past the 2.5-year mark, the truth about Russia's staggering losses is becoming impossible to ignore. While the Kremlin stays silent, the mounting graves across Russia tell a chilling story. In 2023 alone, Russia has spent $2.5 million expanding cemeteries, a grotesque sign of the war's true human cost. This isn't just a statistic. It's double what was spent in 2022 and 6 times the amount in 2020. But the real horror is what's still to come. At the current rate of death, experts predict Russia's troop losses will surge to 1 million by 2025. Think about that, 1 million soldiers gone. The last time a single nation saw such devastation was during World War II, a cataclysm that reshaped the world. Now Russia is hurtling toward this grim milestone in a war Putin refuses to stop, dragging his country deeper into the abyss with every passing day. So how has it come to this? How did one of the world's most feared military forces turn into a machine that consumes its own soldiers faster than it can replace them? And how long can Russia continue throwing men into the meat grinder before it collapses entirely? When you wage a futile war with brutal intensity and reckless persistence, the relentless slaughter of soldiers and civilians becomes an inescapable reality. Here's how Russia's President Vladimir Putin has driven his country and his people toward this devastating milestone, reminiscent of history's darkest years. As of August 28, 2024, Russia has lost precisely 618,960 troops in Ukraine, according to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. This figure includes both fatalities and soldiers who've been so severely injured on the battlefield that they're no longer able to serve. If you're wondering about the proportion, The Economist reports that for every Russian soldier killed in action, there are roughly 3 to 4 wounded. A leaked document from the US Department of Defense leaves room for an even higher number of losses. According to this document, between 462,000 and 728,000 Russian troops have been killed, injured, or captured in Ukraine since the invasion began on February 24, 2022. That's substantially more troops than Putin initially prepared for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with 190,000 soldiers moving into Ukrainian land on that fateful February day. These staggering figures make one thing abundantly clear. Ukrainian soldiers are making the invader pay heavily for every inch of ground gained, even if they're paying quite a high price in the process too. However, whether it's 600,000 or 728,000, this figure is still a few 100,000 soldiers short of 1 million. So how exactly could the projected loss of Russian troops reach this mind-blowing figure in a relatively short period? To answer this question, all we need is some simple maths. Let's use these figures presented by the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces, as it's been publishing daily reports about the situation on the Ukrainian front line. Relying on these reports, we'll see how many troops Russia lost in a single week in Ukraine. As we mentioned, the last available report prior to writing these words was on August 28th. On this date, the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces put the total troop losses at 611,190 soldiers. Let's go back to August 21st to examine the trajectory of the Russian troop losses in a single week. On August 21st, the report published by the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces stated that Russia had lost 603,010 troops since the beginning of its invasion of Ukraine. The very next report, republished on August 22nd, put the total number of lost soldiers at 604,140. This means that in a single day, Russia lost 1,130 of its troops. This figure slightly increased the following day, as the August 23rd report pointed to a total loss of 605,330 troops. That's another 1,190 soldiers lost in a day. The next day showed a similar single loss day, with a reported 1,160 casualties. With this number, Russia lost a total of 606,490 troops. From August 25th to 27th, the total number of lost soldiers increased by 2,420. This means that the figure of 610,100 lost soldiers was reported on August 27th. On the last day prior to writing the script for this video, August 27th, Russia lost another 1,090 soldiers, leading to the 611,190 figure we mentioned a few times. So in total, that's 8,180 soldiers lost in a single week, or an average of 1,168 troops per day. Now let's say this loss rate continues uninterrupted. At an average of 1,168 troops lost per day, the staggering figure of 1 million casualties would be reached within 332 days, on July 26, 2025. If we use the figures coming from the US Defense Department as a starting point and keep the same loss rate, it will only take Russia 232 days to have 1 million of its soldiers wiped from the battlefield. This gives us the grim milestone of April 17, 2025. That's pretty much on par with the predictions of various experts, including Michael Clarke, a British academic who specializes in defense studies. In his interview with Times Radio, a British digital radio station, Professor Clarke claimed that Russia's troop losses could even reach 1 million by the end of 2024, given how little Putin cares for the human cost of his devastating military campaign. The new Chief of the General Staff of the British Army, General Sir Roland Walker, has laid out even more pessimistic forecasts for the Russian troops. General Walker believes that Putin will sacrifice between 1.5 and 1.8 million people in total to achieve his military goals in Ukraine, which is seizing the 4 primary regions or oblasts: Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia. His exact words were, "At the current rate of attrition of dead and wounded, that puts Russia probably well north of 1.5 million casualties to take the 4 oblasts in Ukraine, with untold billions of lost equipment." He also pointed out the absurdity of such a colossal human cost for a strategic aim that increasingly seems both unreachable and irrational. As General Walker put it, there have got to be more things for Russia to worry about than losing the best part of 1.5 to 1.8 million people for a slice of Ukraine with the way the world is going. Unfortunately, as things currently stand, it doesn't seem like it. In fact, it seems that Russia isn't particularly worried about losing all these troops either, although to be fair, the numbers coming from the Kremlin tell a whole different story. The only time the Kremlin publicly acknowledged its troop casualties was in early 2023, and the figure reported was almost insulting in its inaccuracy. At the time, the Kremlin claimed a mere 6,000 Russian soldiers had been killed in Ukraine, a figure that starkly contrasted independent estimates suggesting numbers tens of thousands higher. The disconnect between the official Kremlin figures and the actual losses on the battlefield only deepens the sense of tragedy, as the true scale of human suffering remains hidden behind propaganda and misinformation. Luckily, some Russian independent media outlets have taken great risks to report more accurate figures. As soon as the shameful 6,000 figure came out, Mika Golubovsky, an editor with the now banned Mediazona, immediately disputed it. Closely working with BBC Russia and relying on new graves in Russian cemeteries and open-source information from official reports, newspaper, and social media, Mediazona reported that over 50,000 Russian troops had died in Ukraine. That's 8 times more than what the Kremlin had claimed. Despite the inherent danger of challenging the official narrative in Russia, Golubovsky and other journalists continued their brave reporting. On July 5, 2024, both Mediazona and another independent media outlet, Meduza, published that approximately 120,000 Russian troops had died since the start of the invasion. That's pretty much on par with the figure that the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces reported at the time. The July 5th report from the staff put the total figure of killed and injured soldiers at 548,580. Using the deaths to injured ratio proposed by The Economist between 1 to 3 and 1 to 4, this suggests that between 109,716 and 137,145 Russian troops have been killed in action. Thanks to a slip-up from December 2023, it's safe to assume that Putin is well aware of the true scale of Russian troop losses, but he simply doesn't care. As Yevgenia Chirikova, an exiled Russian environmental activist, puts it, the growing number of killed and maimed on both sides does not bother Putin at all. Until Russian troops receive a tough rebuff in Ukraine, no changes will happen. But if Putin is so indifferent to this staggering human cost, why not just report it accurately? Why not use it to rally the nation around a narrative of sacrifice and patriotism, painting the war as a heroic struggle for Russia's survival? Well, this type of spin would have been possible some tens of thousands of dead soldiers ago. Now reporting actual figures can only backfire, revealing the full extent of the disaster that Putin's regime has tried so hard to conceal. But wait a minute, shouldn't the Russian people be well aware that their friends, family members and neighbors are dropping like flies in Ukraine? Well, they are. But that's people outside Russia's 2 largest cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg. You see, Putin has been very careful not to conscript people from these major cities. Why? Because this way, he shields the urban elite from the direct impacts of the war, preventing a potential backlash from those who have the power to question and challenge his decisions. Additionally, not drafting young men from Moscow or St. Petersburg has caused many wealthy Russians to return to these cities after previously fleeing them to avoid the draft, thus offsetting the economic damage done by Western sanctions. But if Muscovites aren't the ones dying on the Ukrainian battlefield, who is? Who makes up the bulk of the hundreds of thousands of Russian troop casualties? To put it simply, they're troops that the Kremlin doesn't care about. Contract soldiers, foreigners, convicts, reservists, they're the ones filling the ranks and bearing the brunt of the casualties. As far as contract soldiers, or kontraktniki, as they're called in Russia, go, they receive little sympathy from the public or the Kremlin. After all, they chose to enlist and are well paid for their service. As Sergei Krivenko, a human rights activist from Moscow, puts it, ordinary people do not feel particularly sorry for them. And judging by the measures implemented by the Kremlin, Putin doesn't either. In May 2022, the 40-year age limit for contract soldiers was abolished, allowing applicants up to the age of 65 to enlist. Now you might wonder, why would anyone in their 60s willingly head to a conflict zone? The answer lies in the desperate economic circumstances faced by many Russians. For some, the prospect of a well-paying contract job in the military becomes a lifeline amidst financial hardship. In this regard, the broadening of eligibility reflects a grim calculus. When the cost of war becomes unsustainable, the Kremlin is willing to pull from increasingly desperate or less privileged demographics, prioritizing immediate military needs over long-term human costs. To make this brutal calculus possible, the Kremlin has been offering a monthly salary of at least $2,300. To put this figure into perspective, you need to know 2 facts. 1, the salary of a contract soldier before the war in Ukraine was around $360. And 2, the national average income in Russia is roughly $900 a month. And that's in regions that are better off. In poorer regions, it's half of that, $450. Throw the one-off recruitment bonus of at least $2,200 and high payouts in the event of disability, $33,000, and death, $55,000 into the mix, and it becomes clear why the Kremlin's offer is so tempting to those in desperate financial straits. That's also why the Kremlin is constantly hiking up the target figures for kontraktniki. In March 2020, Russia had approximately 405,000 of these soldiers. This figure was expected to rise to 500,000 by 2027. But then Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, so the target figures dramatically increased, while the time frame for achieving them significantly shortened. In December 2022, it was announced that 695,000 contract soldiers would be serving in the Russian armed forces by 2026. A year later, in December 2023, the number was increased to 745,000 troops by 2027. Even with all the incentives, it's easy to see why these figures are unlikely to be met without significant strain. That's why the Kremlin resorted to another shameful tactic, coercing individuals who might otherwise have never volunteered for service. In this sense, the war in Ukraine has started to resemble the Chechen wars, which were primarily fought by forced conscripts. As Kravchenko puts it, these soldiers were sent to slaughter, which caused tension and backlash in society, even to the point of creating social movements. However, the Moscow elites are unlikely to launch any sort of social movements for the bulk of the troops coerced into conscription. Why? Because these are primarily made up of foreigners and convicts. According to numerous media reports, foreigners have been coerced to join the ranks of the Russian armed forces in one of three ways. First, they were deceived about the nature of their prospective employment. Second, they were promised Russian citizenship after only a year of service. Third, they were found guilty of breaking Russian law and given the choice between serving a prison sentence and serving in the war. The first disgraceful way is how a 21-year-old from Sri Lanka found himself on the Ukrainian battlefield. He joined the Russian armed forces for the second reason, receiving Russian citizenship, and was told he would only be employed in a non-combat role. Instead, he was thrust into the front lines, far from the safe, supportive role he'd been promised. That's how he ended up wounded and captured in Ukraine, which is why he also decided to share his story with DW, a German state-owned broadcaster under the watchful eye of Ukrainian military personnel. When he was first sent to the outskirts of the Russian-occupied Ukrainian city of Donetsk, he told his commander that he wanted to return to Sri Lanka. However, he was told that doing so could land him in prison for 15 years per the contract he had signed. So he stayed put, together with dozens of other citizens from India, Kyrgyzstan, Nepal and Tajikistan, all of whom were similarly trapped and betrayed by the Russian military's duplicitous promises. Besides false promises, the Kremlin also showed it had no problem changing the rules of the game whenever it felt like it. Before the war, foreign military recruits had to complete a 5-year contract in the armed forces to obtain Russian citizenship. Once Russian soldiers started dying in bulk, this period was reduced to only 1 year of service. But here's the kicker. Sure, they will receive citizenship after a year, however they'll still have to continue serving, as Putin stipulated that contracts of all kontraktniki will remain valid until the end of his so-called special military operation in Ukraine. During this period, no contracts can be cancelled, and all of those about to expire must be renewed. In other words, foreign fighters don't get to start over in a new country, they get to die as Russians. Russian convicts went through something similar. Initially, the Kremlin was recruiting convicts by promising them a pardon after serving for 6 months, even if they had been convicted of the most violent crimes. However, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the rules changed. The only way for most of these convicts to receive a clean slate was to serve until the end of the war in Ukraine. Also, for many of them, a full pardon was off the table, with only a reduction in their sentences or some other form of leniency being offered. Now, some might see this as just, as people who committed heinous crimes shouldn't be allowed to escape their past so easily. However, the fate of these individuals should be viewed in a greater context. Their situation shows just how easy it is for the Kremlin to exploit the power it inevitably holds over those in desperate circumstances. These prison recruits have not only been thrust into a perilous conflict under false assurances, but they've been practically used as cannon fodder in a war that offers them no real chance of survival or redemption. Ever since Putin ordered the now late Yevgeny Prigozhin to start recruiting prisoners in June 2022, these inmates turned soldiers became prime meat for the Kremlin's grinder. According to the BBC, the inmates recruited by Prigozhin survived in Ukraine for an average of 3 months. Those recruited by Russia's Ministry of Defense after its rift with Prigozhin survived for only 2 months on average. Though several conclusions can be drawn based on the difference between the two figures, the only one that matters is that both the ministry and the Wagner Group, previously led by Prigozhin, treated convicts as nothing more than an expendable force to be thrown into battle. As one soldier who wasn't part of the storm platoons made up entirely of convicts puts it, "Storm fighters, they're just meat." This brings us to another crucial aspect to discuss. How are all these tens of thousands of soldiers dying in Ukraine? By now, the number one way Russian troops are being killed in Ukraine is probably obvious: the infamous meat grinder military tactic. And if that name isn't graphic enough for you, let's paint a clearer picture. The meat grinder refers to the brutal, attritional approach where waves of soldiers are sent into fiercely contested areas, often under relentless artillery fire and close-quarters combat. This strategy is designed to wear down the enemy through sheer numbers and reveal its firing positions, but it comes at a horrific cost. After employing this strategy in the second year of the war in Ukraine, the Russian body count increased by nearly 25%. However, Russia also scored some significant victories in Avdiivka and Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. While helping Russian armed forces to capture Bakhmut in the spring of 2023, the Wagner Group lost 22,000 of its soldiers due to this merciless tactic. And that's where the problem lies. The semblance of success has only added more bodies into the meat grinder. The worst part, the Kremlin is so blinded by these fleeting triumphs that it continues to perpetuate this devastating tactic in Kharkiv, even though it's already proven unsuccessful in the region. The meat grinder tactic also failed in the Battle of Vuhledar, which is still being waged in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. According to the Institute for the Study of War, these ineffective human wave-style frontal assaults have been unsuccessful in the city due to challenging terrain, a lack of combat power, and failure to surprise Ukrainian forces. From this quote alone, two more elements that have been sowing death among the Russian troops become apparent: the lack of combat power and the mighty Ukrainian forces. As far as the first element goes, there have been numerous reports that Russian troops are sent to the front with insufficient training and equipment, and that's putting it lightly. The BBC reports that some of the prisoners recruited for the war in Ukraine had to beg their relatives to buy them proper uniforms and boots. And if the Russian military can't provide something as basic as adequate gear for its troops, it's hardly surprising that they are woefully equipped with inadequate weapons and munitions. According to Vladimir Grubnik, a Russian war supporter and blogger, many soldiers were sent to combat with rifles unsuitable for modern warfare. Others received broken rifles, which can't be either repaired or replaced. Throw the lack of a proper kit and medical supplies into the mix, and you'll understand the shock in Grubnik's words. What a foot soldier should do on the front line without a first aid kit, a spade to dig a trench, and with a broken rifle is a big mystery. You might recall the famous quote, "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men." Right about now, let us stop you there. The soldiers fighting for Russia in Ukraine can barely call themselves that. The only thing that sets these individuals apart from regular people is a fortnight of military training, if that. There are no professional and highly skilled soldiers fighting for their country anymore. No, they're already dead. Now there are only poorly trained individuals recruited with a single goal in mind: to send as many soldiers to the front line as quickly as possible. And what will happen to those soldiers at the front line? That isn't Putin's concern. His only concern is the figures that he can use to boast about Russia's might, but the world sees right through this propaganda. In a statement released on July 12, 2024, the UK Ministry of Defence slammed this approach as ineffective. The statement said, "Although this new approach has increased pressure on the front lines, an effective Ukrainian defense and a lack of Russian training reduces Russia's ability to exploit any tactical successes despite attempting to stretch the front line further." Again, there's the crucial element that has led to many Russian soldiers perishing: an effective Ukrainian defense. Ever since Kyiv didn't fall in a matter of days as initially predicted, one thing became abundantly clear: Ukrainians aren't going down without a fight. And let us tell you, they might be sacrificing a lot, but they're also taking numerous Russian soldiers with them. Telegram, the messaging platform prevalent in Russia, is often flooded by desperate accounts of the surviving Russians about how their units are being terrorized by Ukrainian drones, machine guns, and artillery. However, the Kremlin is known to adapt and overcome, and recently it came up with a new idea of how to locate and neutralize Ukrainian forces, showering them with fire. And to no surprise, this approach involves sacrificing more soldiers. But this time it's not waves of soldiers being sent in to overwhelm a specific position. This time, small detachments of troops are dismounting from their vehicles and advancing on foot toward the Ukrainian firing position. And no, this isn't some kind of Mission Impossible approach, where precision and stealth rule the day. Instead, these soldiers are relentlessly pushed forward to essentially be sacrificed in an effort to locate the Ukrainian firing positions and hit them with artillery. Now, Russia might have substantially more citizens than Ukraine, but it still can't keep up this horrific strategy forever. The staggering loss of life and the constant need for fresh recruits are taking a toll, revealing the limits of a strategy built on sacrifice and brutality. For now, the Kremlin is effortlessly feeding the meat grinder with fresh meat on a regular basis, recruiting up to 30,000 new soldiers a month. But soon the pool of available recruits will dwindle, and the brutal reality of the conflict will come crashing down, leaving the Kremlin to grapple with the consequences of its unrelenting and deadly tactics. Putin is seemingly well aware of this fact, which is why the Russian armed forces are pushing quite hard to make real progress before they run out of time. But the lack of troops isn't the only thing holding them back. The Russian armed forces have also tried to apply pressure everywhere all at once during their summer offensive, causing them to stretch their resources thin and fail to achieve any sustained gains. In a month or two, the weather will also join the fray, further complicating their efforts. Once the heavy rain starts and the ground gets wet, the muddy terrain will become treacherous for both infantry and vehicles. This will not only hamper movement, but also make it difficult to execute any effective combat operation, which the Russians struggle to do even without the rain. And of course, there's always the fact that Russia is gradually plateauing its arms production, leaving the military with fewer resources to replace destroyed munitions and equipment. The relentless pace of the war in Ukraine, combined with sanctions and production bottlenecks, means that the Kremlin's war machine isn't as self-sustaining as it once was. The front lines are practically eating through military stockpiles faster than they can be replenished, forcing Russia into a dangerous reliance on outdated, Soviet-era weaponry and fragile foreign supply chains from China, North Korea, and Iran. In other words, Russia isn't only running out of soldiers, it's running out of everything. No matter how many men Putin throws into the fire, the war is bleeding the country dry. Still, the troop losses are undoubtedly the most tragic and horrifying reality of all. Each new conscript is sent to the front with less training, fewer supplies, and dwindling hope. Russia's war machine, once feared, now consumes its own people faster than it can replace them. These soldiers aren't just losing battles, they're being swallowed whole by a war that has no end in sight. And the most terrifying part, as more lives are sacrificed, nearing the 1 million mark, the Kremlin continues to push forward, turning a blind eye to the devastation and leaving nothing but a wasteland of broken men and shattered families in its wake. But what is your stance on these soldiers? Do you see them as victims of a ruthless regime or mere instruments of war, complicit in their own destruction? And when do you see the 1 million troop mark being passed? By the end of 2024 or sometime during 2025?